Welcome to the Cards Blitz pre-show. I am the one, Christo, your host in the war room today. What is Cards Blitz, you might be asking? Let me tell you, Cards Blitz is a unique format where we have 32 qualifiers go off from Monday to Friday. Now in these qualifiers, you've got pods of up to 16 players who can bring any deck, change them whenever they want, change whatever cards are in them. All they need to do is win their pod and they qualify for the top 32 that went on this past Saturday. That top 32 went down to a top 4 that you're going to see within the hour, casted by both Flake and Admirable. Who's that's Admirable? Well, that's another great question I'm going to be able to answer for you a little bit later on in this show where I sit down and do an interview with him. Before we get to that though, I wanted to jump over to our panel of experts. We have Bubbles and Darkness back here to tell us about their first impressions of Cards Blitz. Thank you so much for joining us here in the War Room, gentlemen. At this point, I feel like you're absolutely regulars, so let's forego the pleasantries and jump right into the meat of things. We had the debut of a brand new tournament format, the Cards Blitz, this week. Whenever you stray from tradition, you're always going to get some mixed reactions. So I wanted to know, maybe we start with you, Darkness, what you thought of this week's Blitz qualifiers that went on during the week.
Well, my reactions were indeed mixed. I had maybe a little too high expectations for this format because previously I was told there are a lot of tournaments doing some time zones in like some brackets. Whenever 8 or 16 people come together, they can start a tournament and it's really like Blitz and over again. And that was not the case. There were tournaments like every 1 hour in some time brackets. But to participate, you had to register very fast and had to wait 1 hour and then start if you are lucky enough to get in. If not, you had to wait and try again the next time. So I was participating and I tried as good as I can, but between my matches and my tournaments I was participating in, there were like cooldown from maybe 2 or 3 hours. And of course, I couldn't participate in all because some were way after midnight and I had to work during the week. These are the negative sides from my side, but of course, you had a lot of times to participate. Like you had 4 days and a lot of different times, 33 in total, where you were able to play in these tournaments to participate in 1, 2, maybe up to 10 if you're viable, and make sure you are able to get a spot in this main event. And overall, I really think this was a very cool format, and I would like to see this again.
I agree. I think that, there are some kinks to work out because it was the first time around. And I think, there was also a little bit of an underestimation of the popularity of it. As you mentioned, Darkness, there were some tournaments that were, had 16 people sign up the second it opened. And yeah, you would have to wait, another almost 2 hours to participate in some cases. So I definitely think that the ability to go at any time during the day, whenever it fit your schedule, is great, but not necessarily being guaranteed a spot because of how popular some of the time slots were definitely makes for a bit of a challenge. What about you, Bubbles? Did you see something similar in the way of your experience? What did you think of the Blitz qualifiers during the week?
Yeah, I had a pretty similar experience to Darkness, I think. One of the things I did like, which is one of the things Darkness touched on, is how many opportunities there were. This meant we had 32 players in the main event, and often main event things are limited to like 8 or 16 people. So the more people we have in the main event, the more enjoyable it is to me. So I really liked how many people got to qualify. And I really like the fact that people could play on different days. Maybe you're busy on a Friday. Well, it's okay. You can play on the Saturday. I think on the actual days, there were imperfections, like Darkness touched on, with the waiting times and sort of having to get this quickly, refreshing the page, trying to enter as quickly as you can. So I think there were some issues with the day-to-day one, but I think overall the idea of the format is a good solid idea, and I'm excited to see how it's improved upon and expanded upon in the future.
And I definitely appreciate where you're coming from, Bubbles, because you also have the scenario where, like you said, some people can't participate on certain days or some people are busy on certain days. So, even asking them to spend, let's say, a full weekend, we've all been there with, 8, 9 round tournaments that can take you a solid 12-hour Saturday and an 8-hour Sunday to complete. So being able to jump in and know you only have to commit a couple hours to get into that top 32 is really, really interesting as well. Sticking with that, talking about the top 32, Bubbles, obviously it's a little bit more of a classic single elimination format. What were your thoughts on the top 32?
I would like to see a few changes in the top 32 personally. I know there's no deck restrictions, and I think that's perfectly fine for the qualification stage when there's lots of people. But I don't see why for the 32 you couldn't have some sort of deck restriction, whether it just be nation, not necessarily deck submitted, just can't bring the same nation after you've won with it in the same best of 3. I personally would have liked to see something like that, but overall I had a great experience with it, and I definitely had a really nice time.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So you would have liked to have seen kind of that top 32 resemble a little bit more of the classic single elimination conquest style, bring at least your different nations and have to win with them. What about you, Darkness? Do you share kind of that thought process around the top 32?
This great, fast single elimination process we saw in the qualifier and in the main event was definitely interesting. But maybe the main event could be more like other tournament style with maybe bans, maybe some restrictions focused on main nations, or maybe even one lower bracket. So it's not very fast, just play this through. Whoever had the most luck and the best deck prepared will win. But a little bit more strategic in deck-wise and what you're going to pick.
Right. Well, speaking with that, as we kind of talk about, deck selections and things, obviously this is a huge departure from what you would normally see, where you're either submitting a deck, submitting your main nation, talking about bans, things like that. In this case, there are no deck lists. You can change your decks whenever you'd like. What was your strategy then? Do you come in saying, I have these 5 or 6 decks in my repertoire, and depending on the situation and the kind of micro meta of this qualifier or the top 32, I'll change? Is it I'm going to change 1 or 2 cards expecting to counter something? Like, Darkness, what were you thinking when you were preparing for this tournament?
I prepared some deck lists, and very, very different. Some aggressive deck lists, some discard deck lists, some anti-aggro, some control, some ramp. And they were based on previous tournament and on the meta deck lists, so I know they are good. And then I just listened to my feeling, like, what is this guy probably bringing? Is he playing maybe aggressive? If he's bringing maybe control, and trying to counter the general idea, or based on his previous deck, if my opponent maybe won with an artillery deck, is he going to bring this again? Do I counter that, or is he expecting countering that? And should I counter his counter to my counter? That happened to me, and that worked, but only in the first place.
So Bubbles, kind of a similar question, I guess. Do you sometimes end up getting in your head a little bit when you're going through that process of, do I counter his counter? Do I maybe just tweak 1 or 2 cards thinking he's going to come back with the same thing? Is it a lot of thoughts that kind of get you a little bit confused with where you're going? Or do you just pick a line and say, you know what, aggro works for me, or artillery's working for me, let me just go the whole way with this list?
So during every single qualifying game, I played exclusively Jaggro, which is a strong meta deck right now, and I decided I was just going to play it over and over again, no matter what. And then in my first round of the top 32, I went down that line again, just picking Jaggro. And then I got matched against John PX, who's a very strong player. And I sort of got into that mind game of, I'm going to bring this to counter this, to bring that. And the moment I got into that mind game, I lost. I find Not that those mind games aren't a good strategy. I'm just so terrible at them that it's better just to bring Jaguar over and over again and just sort of bonsai your opponent and hope for the best. I think there's certainly something to be said about countering your opponent's decks, but you can also get sort of lost in it and get caught up in it, and then miss out on very obvious plays which you've missed in the game because you're too busy thinking about, oh, if they bring this deck, then I'm going to bring that deck, when you could just be smashing them with what you're best with.
That's, I think, a big part of it as well. You know, whenever you're going into a scenario, you have to look at what am I comfortable playing? What do I want to bring? You know, sometimes too, you can look at that deck and Darkness, you brought up the point of, hey, I'm bringing some strong meta decks, some decks I'm comfortable with, previous tournament decks. And then you start thinking, well, what if I just tweak this? Or what if I just change this mid-tournament? And all of a sudden it throws everything off. So I definitely think that focus, Bubbles, I can definitely appreciate that thought process of, hey, let me just go with what I'm comfortable with, what's worked so far, and let me keep just hammering it home. Now, you two are two of the top players in cards today, but I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a newer player. This Blitz tournament, you know, again, a very different style. Do you think this is more accessible to newer players who may not want to spend, you know, 12 hours on a Saturday playing in a classic cards open style? Let's start with you, Bubbles.
I think at first glance it is, but I think once you start to look at it a bit closer, there's certain format parts which might turn off new players. One of those is its knockout. I think Swiss is very favorable for new players. Obviously, there's the thing of putting in time, but I think new players are comfortable to put in the time if they know they're going to get to play games and they know they're going to get a good experience out of it. I personally think if you're looking at just new player experience, doing a sort of newbie Swiss tournament is much more accessible. However, I certainly don't think this is inaccessible to new players. And I think so for your sort of mid-tier players, your people who are maybe comfortable with the game but haven't had too much tournament exposure, that's where this sort of tournament's perfect because they have lots of opportunities to try and prove themselves where they're very low committal and they can just go back into it over and over again. And before you know it, they've knocked out these amazing players and they've qualified for the top 32.
I think that's a great point as well, Bubbles, because that mid-level player may also not have the collection necessary to put together, let's say, 3 different main nation decks. But if I can bring 1 or 2 different styles, it's a lot easier for me to play something I'm comfortable with over and over again. And like you said, maybe, you know, get the right matchup, get the right deck matchup, and go through to the top 32. So maybe that's where, you know, Blitz is kind of key, is for some of those mid-level players to kind of get in and get involved in the game at a higher level than they would be otherwise. What about you, Darkness? Do you think the same thing? This kind of isn't maybe ideal for some of the newer players, but fits that mid tier. Where do you see Blitz being kind of the most beneficial?
I think it's definitely beneficial for newer player, as you mentioned, because you can bring maybe 1 or 2 cheap but good deck lists and just run only these. And because of the timings, you do have 32 timings to start in one of these qualification matches. You can start very early on, probably facing a lot of strong player, but testing and learning from this, and the more days and brackets will go on, the best player already qualified, and you are left with maybe more equal player. And the timings, of course. I know some of the latest brackets, they were very low. There were a very low amount of player, so the chance of getting qualified is there higher too. If you're just able to commit a lot of time on finding the right time and right place for you to get into this main event.
I think that's a great point as well, because as time goes on, like you said, more and more of those top level players are qualifying for that event. So they're not continuing to play. So the first few qualifiers might be a little bit more challenging, might have a few more players, but as time goes on, those matchups might become a bit easier. And, you know, Bubbles, you touched on it before, having newer players or even those mid-tier players start getting more reps in tournaments and higher stress situations, let's say, it continues to make them better players. So I think that, yeah, finding the right place, the right time, qualifying, and even playing a round or 2 of the top 32 can really kind of get that competitive drive going and continue to have them be involved in the cards tournament scene going forward. So now it is time, the traditional time to put your money where your mouth is. Predictions. Who is taking this home? We've got J. King, John, Ari, and Spoos in the top 4. Who is taking home the full prize pool? All the marbles. Who do you got, Darkness?
Well, of course, I'm cheering for my teammates, Ari and J. King, but this is the first time Spoos reached the finals, the top 4, and is receiving prize money from a KARDS tournament. I will bet this time on my streamer, on my co-streamer, on my streamer friend, streamer colleague. So I'm going with Spoos here.
All right, Darkness has got Spoos. Bubbles, what about you?
You know, there's a saying as old as time, and that saying goes, I'm Spoos, you lose. I'm also betting on Spoos. You know, my good friend, my teammate, I want to see him take it home. He deserves a win. He's very good at the game, and go Team Spoos. First time I think me and Darkness are voting for the same person.
I think so. The first time both of you are in agreement. It's a new tournament style. It is a whole new world here on the expert panel where the two of you are agreeing. Who knew this was possible? But thank you both so much for taking the time. I do appreciate the feedback on the Blitz tournament style. I am also very excited to see where this tournament style leads us down the line. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for once again taking the time to sit down with me and share your feedback about the KARDS Blitz format. Now, next up, we have an interview with Admirable. You may recognize him from his time behind the caster's desk in Hearthstone. He's a veteran of many different card games, and this is going to be his debut in KARDS. So I sat down with him a little bit earlier this week just so I could get to know him a little bit better and have him introduce himself to each and every one of you. Mr. Admirable, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on the War Room before your casting debut. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing pretty fantastic. You know, I'm just always really excited to do any sort of content-related stuff, especially when it comes to card games. I mean, card games have just been my entire life since as far as I can remember. So I'm stoked always to be here today to explain things because that is the second passion of mine.
The second passion of yours? Wait, what's the first passion then?
Card games.
The explaining is the second passion.
Correct.
I got it now. Fantastic. Getting to know you already. That's great. You did mention card games, so some people might be familiar with you with your time through Hearthstone, but for those of our fans out there who do not know you or aren't familiar with you, do you want to take a quick second and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Nathan Zamora. You might know me better as Admirable or That's Admirable. If you don't, there you have it. I've basically been playing games my entire life, and it has been solely focused mostly around card games, though I have played stuff like Dota and League of Legends, you know, the really popular games that all my friends tended to play. Really, the thing that kept me into card games, though, was the community aspect of it, and that in tournaments, even though these are like 1v1 competitive events, what you're doing is you're finding relationships within those, of people to practice with, or people to work with, or share ideas and bounce things off of. And what ends up happening is, despite the fact that it's this very sole individual competition, is that you end up getting these big community groups of stuff where people all collaborate with each other, despite the fact that they're directly competing with each other, which I've always found very interesting and very unintuitive. Kind of the same reason that cards have been interesting to me, is that a lot of the mechanisms and things you do tend to be counterintuitive to what you would normally think. And so I feel like that community appeal plus the mystery and to have it unveiled part of card games has really captured my interest and kept me involved.
I have asked that question a lot, and I have not always had it so eloquently put. So you mentioned that, you know, sometimes it's kind of counterintuitive. Do you want to dive more into that? I'm really, really curious as to what you mean by that.
Yeah, so just from the community aspect, again, like the juxtaposition of it's a 1v1 competitive tournament, yet people are working in groups. That to me is just already its own thing. There's not really too much explanation that's needed there. But for card games, a lot of times it feels like just whatever the biggest and best card you can play is going to be the best thing you can play. But the real situation is that card games are very contextual and they're very situational. So a lot of times cards that are, I'd say, pound for pound, some of the worst cards available can be one of the best things you can do just simply because of the situation that you're in. And that's going to be different even if you play the exact same decks against each other over and over again. The situation that you arrive in is what's going to be driving that context of what the most powerful things are. And that's very unusual, I would say, to a game like chess where your queen is just your best piece.
Right. And I think that's so interesting because you mentioned chess, and my thought process went immediately to poker, where you're sitting down across from somebody and everybody's playing with the same cards, but depending on the hand you're dealt, depending on the situation you're in, depending on what your read on your opponent is in, a lot of these card games, and I imagine if you've been playing them your whole life, you've probably done a lot of paper games as well, sitting across from your opponent. But
Oh
when
yeah.
you're playing something digital, you don't get to, look in that person's eyes, but that doesn't mean you can't sort of establish their play style, their thought process, what might be in their hand. And to your point, yeah, maybe we slow play this one. Maybe we play something that's a little bit awkward and just see what happens.
Yeah, I think the poker is an excellent example that you provided, that where the ace is the best card in the deck, but sometimes the three is the best one depending just on what game you're playing and how many threes you can come up with at that point. So I think it's an excellent example. And for the digital read and stuff like that, yeah, being able to discern players' play style versus a player's comfort level, they can definitely mean various things as well. So I think that's a pretty excellent point to make also.
So you talked a lot about, the tournament aspect, the community aspect, things like that. You've made more of a name for yourself as a caster. Has that always been the case where you want to participate in tournaments as well? Kind of where has the casting come from your background?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and there's hopefully not as long of an explanation as I'm picturing in my head. I started playing cards when I was 11. It started with in 1996 when I started playing Magic, and that kind of just really captured my attention. And by the time I was 12, I had already made this decision that I'm going to continue playing games the rest of my life. I don't care how I'm going to do it. I'm going to make a career out of this somehow, whether it's making the games, selling the games, trading the games, playing the games. I don't care what it was going to be. It was just going to be something with games. I decided that very, very young. And there's been very high highs and very low lows as a result of that path that I have chosen to follow. In 2000, I'd say late in 2013, throughout my late stages of high school and early on, once I had gotten out of high school, theater was a thing that I had participated in. I took a lot of improv theater classes, and it just really wasn't for me. I felt like on the theater aspect, because a lot of it was just planned things. Even in the improv section of it, it felt like it was a little bit too planned, and there wasn't enough dynamic to it to me. Everything kind of had its very solid rundown of how you wanted it to progress. And so about 2013, when internet and esports stuff started becoming a lot more popular, especially for card games, that was really where I decided to pursue streaming stuff. And just the fact that I had vocally trained a lot, I tried to work in just vocal aspect of career for a long time. And the fact that I understood just how microphone stuff worked, and just my general experience with theater kind of really naturally led me down that progress for becoming a caster at some point. I got asked to cast one event, people really liked it, and so I kept continuously getting asked over and over again. And that's pretty much been my career for the last 7 years. But as far as the casting aspect of it goes, I feel like that having this passion for explaining things and storytelling, as well as having this passion for card games, just found this very serendipitous road that it kind of crossed, where it's like people want to see card games played, they want them in tournaments, and you need a talent to explain that sort of stuff. It's like, wow, how did this fall together at this? This is so lucky. And that's, kind of like playing a card game. Sometimes you just draw the perfect card, and that's really what ended up happening.
But I really love that explanation. It's so interesting that you went from, the aspect of, well, I love cards, I love games. I kind of touched on this theater stuff, and then it all sort of fell together. I asked Flake the same question when I did the interview with him, and his path was very similar, except it was through radio. So he, at his college, was, the GM of the radio station, was doing radio stuff, did an internship. It wasn't quite the direction he was going to lead, but hey, I love cards, I love gaming, I'm streaming, and all of a sudden it just kind of all rolls together. So I think it's so interesting how those different aspects kind of just fall into place. People might look at a streamer, a caster, whatever the case may be, and go, oh, well, he just plays the game and he's good at the game, and here he is doing this job. But, there's more to it than just saying, I can read these cards and I can say what's happening. There's a lot more to it when you're, to your point, storytelling and that overarching piece around the game, the tournament, etc.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the thing with Flake and with radio and how he got into it. I met Flake in Tour Stop Philadelphia a few years back, and we have kind of just kept in contact since then. And the more I've gotten to know Flake, the more I've realized that him and I have just had very similar paths of things, and enjoy like kind of the same stuff in terms of like entertainment and the card games we like to play, and just kind of the way that we like to have conversations. It's very, I'd say, odd how very similar we are, despite the fact that we're just colossally different in terms of like where we grew up and how we grew up and et cetera like that. I did work in radio for a little bit of time. I'm usually kind of embarrassed to talk about this because it was on a talk radio show in Houston at like 2 a.m. And the way that this radio show would go is I'm not going to name the name of it or anything like that. I'm just going to tell this story. He would have me come in the afternoon and record like 50 pretend call-in calls. Like he'd be like, we're going to take calls right now. And I'm like, man, it's 2 a.m. Who's calling in at 2 a.m. to this radio show to discuss these weird like conspiracy theory things that this guy's coming up with? And so he would have me record like 50 different call-ins, and then he would choose the ones he thought were best. And then he would argue with those call-in things and hang up on them disgustedly to try and prove his point that people that disagreed with him were insane and stupid. And I was just like, I can't do this anymore. This is so demeaning. And frankly, you're not even paying me that much. So I'm just going to quit that. And that was kind of really, honestly, I remember that point specifically because that really is what turned me into like, okay, I'm going to do card game stuff full time from this point, because working regular jobs it always felt like it was a little bit difficult for me. I always just had like a thirst and a hunger for something more and something that I personally loved.
It's actually funny. So make sure when you get a chance, ask Flake about his experience interning at a radio station if you haven't already asked him that, because while not exactly the same as yours, it kind of ended sort of the same way. So definitely a conversation you should have with him. And anybody out there, ask him about his experience in radio when he's streaming or something. It's a good story.
Point taken.
So you mentioned when you're talking about tournaments and you've got, let's say, teams preparing together, people preparing together, and it can create really interesting narratives. We've seen in the cards environment, Berto Burrito brought into the game with J King. J King kind of trained him, showed him the ropes. And recently we've had Berto kind of surpass the teacher and win a few games and win a few tournaments recently. So I think there is that aspect to it, the storytelling piece. If I go and compare, let's say, casting to that sports analogy, would you say you're more of that storyteller? Are you more of the play-by-play guy, more color commentary, the analyst? Where do you fit into that?
Yeah, it's so when I was casting with Hearthstone for a long time, it was mostly we did have roles I'd say that we were more situated to, and for me that definitely was analysis, because I went from mostly being competitive in playing to casting the game. I think I was probably the first person to actually take that kind of direct route, where it was I tried to compete very actively. I got far in some tournaments, but as soon as I would get knocked out of those tournaments, the first thing that would happen is people would ask me to cast the events instead. And I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'll keep picking this up. Like, this is still a way to, have some income going from trying to play these games all the time. And so when I got into that, it definitely was an analyst role. But for card games, it's so much different than say I don't know, like a sports match. Like sports match they have very, very planned things that are happening. A lot of times they're timed. Like you look at basketball, there's 4 quarters that go to it. There's a very clear offense and defense role if you are watching the game. It's, this team has the ball, they're on their side of the court. With card games, that offense and defense role constantly shifts and changes. And sometimes the perception of who's the offense or who's the defense is not readily held by both players, let alone by people who are watching the game. Sometimes it's tough to discern who's ahead just when you can see both hands. And so with card games, I felt like it's really had to train me to be open to the idea of what the discussion or the topic is going to be at that point. And I feel like it's both helped and hurt me. It's like a double-edged sword. In some situations, I feel like I've gotten stronger at casting because I can talk about a lot more topics. But at the same time, I don't necessarily feel like I've strengthened myself in one particular role. And I feel like this is pretty specific to card games, like maybe baseball, but baseball's basically like a real life card game.
Yes.
So with card games, I feel like we have this open role. I would tend to prefer a more analytical role because I feel like I can explain very difficult situations with fewer words than I would say are normally acceptable to explain some of these situations. I try to compact it into one singular thought in case something else arrives very quickly afterwards, which, players drawing cards every turn, that tends to happen. So I'd say analyst mainly, but card games very well rounded. And I feel like that's a strength that you have both as a competitive player, as an entertainer, or just even as someone watching it. Try not to pick one specific thing to look at. Try to look at a lot of different things and try to tune yourself in with a bunch of other things. It's a good way to enjoy card games, to cast card games, to play card games. Card games are about being well rounded, jack of all trades.
For sure. And that way you don't put yourself in any kind of box either when it comes to an opportunity. Hey, we can bring Admirable in and he can do anything. We'll have him dance in the intermissions and he'll be all set.
I'll do the call.
Beauty. I know Flake's a big fan as well. So going into, let's say, a new environment like this, a new game, new casting partner, because I don't believe you and Flake have actually casted together before. How do you prepare for that?
There's a lot of different ways to prepare for it. And I'd say for me and Flake, mostly the preparation is just going to be the fact that we know each other. I think that's probably one of the biggest preparations. We'll predetermine some generalized roles and things like that. I would say that one of the biggest things for me for coming into a casting prep, though, is just going to be depending on the work. And so for this particular event that Flake and I will be casting, you can find Flake at WatchFlake on Twitter or Twitch, by the way. We're going to be, casting this for a little bit longer than I would say I'm used to when I'm doing a big spectacle event where they get, pairs of casters and you have different roles and you have to do like little different jobs and you kind of rotate around. Vocal prep is going to be a lot of that because if my voice wears out throughout the day, what that means is it's a lot harder to let myself be excited about things. It's a lot harder to control the way my vocal inflection works. So a lot of like breathing warm up that's coming into that event. Make sure I'm drinking a lot of water. As I'm going through that day and leading through that day and such. But then also it's just being up to date with what the game is presenting, understanding like who the players are, like trying to watch some of their games if I can and get attuned to their style. Because as much as people like to say that there are right and wrong things to do in card games, people definitely do have styles. That's kind of one of the traits of people and why storytelling is so interesting. There's always something about them that just keeps coming up over and over again. So trying to understand a player's play style or just make sure that I'm in tune with it very quickly so that if I see it, I can identify it and perhaps find a line to talk about in something like that. Most of it is just being sharp and on point on that particular day. I'd say that's the biggest part of the prep.
I love that. And I'm really excited to see the two of you cast together because I think that aspect of storytelling and really diving into it with each character and each individual within this tournament is going to be a lot of fun. It is more than just so-and-so plays card X, moves to the front row. There's so much more to it when it comes to that storytelling piece. So I'm really, really excited to see more of that. While we're talking about casting, what advice would you have for any aspiring casters who are looking to, maybe move out of the tournament scene and kind of move towards a casting piece like you were talking about, or just in general looking to move to that broadcast style?
Yeah, it's definitely a tough question. When I kind of look at my life in particular, it's like, well, what did you do to get into casting? It's like, well, I dedicated my entire life from 12 years old into playing cards, pursued it very actively, regardless of feast or famine, and continued to pursue it relentlessly, knowing that if I continued to fail at it over and over again, I would just eventually starve and die. So don't do that part. But I would say that being able to actively work at it and address yourself, don't ask other people what they think of your stuff. Watch and learn your own stuff and see how it is. Like, you've seen all the people on American Idol who sing and they do it terribly. Guaranteed those people do not record themselves, listen to it and go, yeah, that's perfect. None of them did that. So when you listen to your own stuff, do that and judge it accordingly. Don't be harsh on the judgment, but be critical about it. Be sharp and on point with it. Pick up the things that you did that were interesting and try to flourish on that one particular element. If you find things that you're weak at doing, either improve them or get them out of the way. Then after that, do the one thing that I've always been afraid to do, which is ask. Anytime you see an opportunity anywhere, message those people and say, here's my resume. I want to cast. Here's what I've done. Here's the thing you can look at. Please consider me for the event. Thanks for your time. I have very rarely done that my entire life because I was raised in the notion that asking for help was a bad idea, but that working hard enough and then letting people offer you stuff was a better idea. That's incorrect. Ask people for stuff. I promise you they're not going to be that offended. And if they were, it's probably not someone you want to work with anyway.
I think that's a really good point because I think so many people are taught, yeah, you know what, you work hard, you put in the time and somebody's going to recognize you, somebody's going to find you. And, when that was the case in a smaller type of world, sure. But when you've got the internet to pick from, it definitely changes things and changes the scope. Based on that, do you think, and I'm not to date you because I feel like we're about the same age, but you said you committed yourself from 12 years old, pre-internet even, to kind of get to where you are today. Do you think it is more difficult, easier, just different to kind of get into, let's say, a casting role today versus what it was for you a few years ago?
I would definitely say the internet makes pretty much everything easier except for keeping your privacy. Back when I was a wee lad, it was Netscape Navigator and dial-up at the library is what our choice for internet really was. And casting for games didn't really exist when I was that young. Again, it was 1997 is when I turned 12 years old. So we just didn't, like, esports stuff had just barely started getting born. Like, I remember it was like Joe Miller and D-Man 20 something years ago. They were producing, spectating, casting, everything was done on their own. And I've seen clips of like Too Good falling asleep alongside Joe Miller just because they had been producing and casting event for so long, but then they just roll right through it. They're like, we got to keep going. The tournament's still going. That was the very young days of esports stuff happening. And since the internet has become such a broadly accepted tool for, basically everything now, it's just a great way to share information. It's definitely made it a lot easier, but it has made it more competitive as well. So
Right.
I'd say the talent that you need to have in order to step into that thing, it's definitely increased because you have a larger pool of people. But the way to get into that spot once you have that talent, not nearly as difficult. It's much easier to get a hold of people now.
Absolutely. Fair enough. So now you, I mean, I'm looking at you during this interview, and this might be a personal question because I might be a bit jealous, but
Go
how
on.
do you maintain that luscious beard? Sorry,
Well, for this
completely out of left field. I'm just looking at you. I'm like, it's a nice, well put together thing.
For this particular one, I just don't do anything to it. This is the COVID haircut, and it's just I didn't even realize I was going to be on camera today. I was told I was going to be, but I didn't realize that I was going to be. So I should have just gotten my hair done, kind of coming into this. But usually when I'm taking care of it and I have to do it very actively, I do trim it myself. And then from there, it's just a lot of facial products that get piled onto everything to kind of make sure that my skin and my hair maintains quality of life. I'm turning 36 this year, and so I'm not getting any younger. It's time to start investing in these things that definitely work and putting them on my skin and letting them do its thing. Because if you don't, it gets very itchy otherwise, and I can't stand that. I have too much sensitivity to everything. If it's above 70, it's too hot, and if it's below 70, it's too cold. That's Fahrenheit, of course. But from there, it's mostly just making sure that I have quality organic products that I put on my skin because my skin's really sensitive to chemical stuff. So it's just mostly like diligent use of facial products that keep everything in order.
I'm taking notes because top notch. Well, hey, I mean, you talked about the vocal bit before, but it is important as well that, you do have to be on camera. You do have long days. You do have a lot going on. So, being able to keep yourself in top shape for those performances, that casting is important as well, right? It's a full package.
Yeah. It definitely is. Like I should put more time into exercising and stuff. I mostly just do it for vocal and breathing exercises, but I definitely do want to more physically exercise. When I first started casting, I was actually pretty overweight, and I wasn't overweight by anything other than just my own consumption of calories. Really, I've lost the weight and gained the weight several times throughout my life. I've been very poor at keeping it off. But recently, I'd say the last 2 years, I lost a bunch of weight leading into an event that was taking place in the Bahamas. It was just my wife and I, my now wife and I had just decided we want to get in better shape. So we started eating better and we started doing a little bit of exercise and we kind of kept control over that. And what I noticed was I was like, hey, I just look a lot better when I'm on camera this way. And I was like, wow, that seems to make a lot of sense. Like they say the camera adds 10 pounds. I say it adds more like 40. But, that just meant that I had to lose a little bit more even on top of that. So I've lost the weight. I've gained a little bit of it back, but I've kind of found this level where I've flattened out now. Like I'm not too overweight. I'm at a happy spot, and I think exercise would just balance that whole thing out. So I am in agreement with you on that. I don't think it's super important to look good, but it is important to take care of yourself because it just helps you feel better. And when you feel better, you have more confidence. And when you have more confidence, you sound better. And when you sound better, people like listening.
Absolutely. And I think you hit it spot on. It's not around being perfect, but being comfortable and confident in who you are and how you are. And that absolutely translates when you're, talking to anybody and about anything. So going back to the beard piece, actually, because I'm not entirely obsessed, just a little bit. Would you say that the beard has become a bit of a calling card? It's very prominent in, a lot of your logos and things like that. Is it something you decided that was going to be a thing or it just kind of happened? Or am I just reading into this too much?
It probably a little bit too much, but it has become in some instances a big recognition point. So much to the so that more people I noticed, like my old colleagues, they would recognize when they had a beard that, oh, that's that Admirable guy. So they would omit the B themselves, despite the fact that the B was what they were focused on, the beard. And they would literally walk up to colleagues of mine and say my name. And similarly, I was experiencing the inverse as well. And I was like, I did notice that a lot of us just have beards now. Never really thought about this before. The reason I grew out a beard initially was because shaving just became so expensive for me. Like my beard grows at an astonishingly rapid rate. Like people call it like, oh, that's great genetics. You get a beard for it. I can't shave. I cannot do it. If I shave in the morning, 20 minutes later, I'll have a beard again. It's like Tim Allen in the Santa Claus. It just does not stop. And so that was the initial reason I grew it. And the first time I grew a beard, I just didn't take care of it at all. I just kind of I looked at myself one day. I was like, this probably could be cleaned up a little bit. And I was like, oh, it looks pretty sharp actually. I don't really mind this so much. So I've kind of just hung on to it at this point because I enjoy having one. But then B, it's not shaving. Shaving became painful for me literally because it was just my beard grows so fast and it's so thick and weird at its root. I'm sorry this sounds very personal and maybe TMI. But the point is, I've kept the beard around because I just think I look better with it. It looks like I may have a face and a jawline or a chin under here. I promise you, I have a severe case of cantaloupe head, where my head is perfectly spherical and round with just a little bit of texture stuff going on.
Fair enough. I mean, My head is a perfect cantaloupe. I don't know how to segue from that personally, but I can identify with you when you say that your beard grows very quickly. I once had a job where I had to have a completely clean shaven face. My first day at noon, they approached me and said, hey, you need to shave every day. I was like, I did this morning. Well then, so speaking of, the reason I ask about the beard is because for myself as well, the recognition point when I saw you casting Hearthstone was, he's the guy with the beard. That was just kind of where that came from. And then I learned that, well, that's Admirable. So to kind of segue over to your name, actually, where did that come from? Where does the handle Admirable, or that's Admirable, come from?
So this was years ago when season 1 of Game of Thrones came out, and I was just watching season 1 over and over again. And there's this one scene where Alistair Thorne kind of walks in on Jon Snow and, why can't I remember his name now? Samwell Tarly. And they're just messing around in the mess hall, and he catches them. And he starts giving them this wacky speech about how they're not grown men and they don't know anything and they're not tough and they're not like him, Alistair Thorne. And he looks at Jon and he's like, was it uncomfortable in Winterfell? Where the days you just couldn't get warm, never mind how many fires your servants built. And Jon Snow is just pissed. He is looking at him and he's like, I build my own fires. And right when he says that, Alistair Thorne, it's like he just knew Jon Snow was going to say, I build my own fires. And he's like, oh, that's admirable. he's like, yeah, you idiot. Oh, yeah, real tough for you to build your own fires. Yeah, what a big man you are.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was the funniest thing in the world that Alistair Thorne it felt like he had planned this the entire time. And so that was part of my idea. But the real reason I picked it was because I was determined to become a professional gamer. So that inspired the name, but I was determined to have Artosis cast my name incorrectly one day. And the very first time, of course, that he's casting it, it's him and Doa. They're casting a match of mine playing cards. And Doa, as soon as he sees it, he goes, I'm sorry if you guys can't see anything different either, but all I can see is that sad Admirable, and I can't unsee it. So I'm sorry if you can't either. And I was like, they diffused it in 5 seconds! And that was part of what inspired me to also become a good caster, was the fact that they had taken this thing that I had found as a difficulty, saying that's admirable all in one word when referring to a single person, and just completely demolished that idea. And I was like, wow, just bravo. That is brilliant. I have to be that good one day.
I have to say that is a skill, though. It's so often a handle comes up and you're like, wait, what is that? Especially if you don't have the capital letters there, it can be confusing. I can understand that.
Yeah.
Before I let you go, I have the rapid fire section of questions here. So I've got 5 questions for you. You are allowed an answer and like 1 line of explanation max. So gotcha. I want to keep it simple. I want to keep it easy. What is your favorite topping on pizza?
Spicy Italian sausage. Spicy things are better than non-spicy things.
Amazing. Love that answer. If you could have dinner with one person, living or dead, who would it be?
Mark Twain.
Interesting. Fictional character. Same question.
Mark Twain.
Favorite band?
Oasis.
Lovely. And favorite TV show?
Lately, it's been Ted Lasso. Ted Lasso is the most positive person I've ever met, and it's very inspiring.
I've heard great things about it. I've heard great things. I have to check it out.
Watch it, definitely.
Wonderful. Will do. So that wraps it up. Admirable, thank you so much for hanging out. Where can people find you?
Super easy. @that's Admirable on everything. Type it in the Google, and that's how you find it.
I love how simple you have kept it. It makes it so much easier. But thanks again for joining us in the War Room. And Admirable, best of luck in your cast of Cards Blitz.
Thank you very much. Have a great day. Ramp is the ability to increase the credits you can use each round, even beyond 12 credits. You're able to use more and earlier high-cost, high-value units and orders. This archetype is usually slow in the early until the mid-game and ridiculously strong in the late game. At the end of the January season, this archetype was not often being played, but since more players are trying to counter tier 1 decks with discard or some control decks, US ramp decks are seen slightly more often. This deck list is very strong in the late game against any kind of control matchup, but is weak to high-tempo decks such as air, artillery, and aggro. The most popular version of this deck is US and Britain. Variations include US-Japan, US-Soviet, Britain-US, and Soviet-US. Your key ramp cards are the War Machine and War Bonds to get an early credit advantage. In the late game, these cards are used to increase the maximum credits beyond the 12 normal capacity. Combined with early sustain cards like 593rd Jasco and East Surrey Regiment, plus AoE removal like Carpet Bombing, the ramp mechanic leads you into the late game. This deck wants to use the credit advantage to defeat your opponent with high-cost, high-value cards like High Altitude Bombing, TBF Avenger, and US Military Research. This archetype is using the discard ability to remove cards from your opponent's hand. Combined with draw denial, the win condition is to keep the opponent from using their win condition. When the opponent doesn't have any cards or options left, pretty much any unit is able to take down the enemy headquarters. In the January season, the popularity of aggressive decks increased. These decks rely on card draw and are weak to cheap removal. This discard list is targeting these weaknesses and is quite strong against Tier 1 decks Brit Air, Artie & Co., but is not quite powerful enough to make it a Tier 1 deck itself. The most popular build is a Germany-Britain combo, with variations in Germany-Japan and Britain-Germany. Key cards are those with discard mechanics like U375, Wolfpack and Annihilation, and cards with a draw-deny mechanic like Admiral Hipper, Panther A, and MI5. Artie decks use the unit type Artillery, like the name already suggests. These units can attack any unit without getting damaged. Combined with buffs and tempo cards, this deck can be very powerful in the early until the mid-game. At the end of the January season, this archetype became more popular because of its decent win rate, and was played more often by top players, such as Darkness. The strengths of this deck are the artillery unit type and the tempo potential it wields. With buffs, artillery units are able to destroy nearly every other unit without trading. When removing the opponent's units, you can establish a decent board presence while preparing for the lethal buff combo. Weaknesses are cheap removal cards like Sudden Strike, Tactical Strike, Bloody Sickle, Air Superiority, you name it. Not to mention AoE removals like Carpet Bombing, Empire Strikes, and Root Out the Enemy. The most popular is the Soviet-US combo, with the variation being the inverse. The second Tier 1 deck sitting at the top of the meta is Brit Air. As the name implies, it is an aggressive archetype which is based on cheap fighters and bombers combined with powerful buff cards. By using early bombers with a large choice of buff cards, this deck is able to establish board control quickly and build up tempo to finish the game either with several large units or a massive burst combo. Brit Air is one of the oldest deck types in the game, being incredibly popular even before the 2019 World Championship. Its popularity was diminished after the Allegiance expansion released Flampanzer, an incredibly efficient way to remove the buffed 1-credit planes. But since then, this deck has been hibernating, coming back for brief periods of time if the meta allowed it. This deck has remained almost completely unchanged since its glory days. The recent nerf to Flampanzer, making it unable to target air units, has spiked the power of air in the meta, making this deck one of the most popular and most powerful aggro decks during the January and February season. Because Brit Air relies on one specific unit type, air can be hard countered by cards such as Sky Barons or just anti-air guns. But these tech choices are rare and leave the deck weak in other matchups, because bounce to remove large buffs and discard to target the low draw potential are the most efficient ways of targeting air. US tempo decks with Half Track and 99th, as well as German discard decks with Sudden Strike and Wolfpack, have the best matchups without needing to run specific counter cards. The most powerful version of Brit Air is with Japan as the ally, which offers Burst of Fire for massive burst and air superiority for tempo removal. The US ally is a powerful alternative with Greyhound, but it lacks the explosive power of the Japanese version. The key cards are the powerful 1-credit, 1-attack, 3-defense British aircrafts, Swordfish Mk1 and Gladiator Mk1. They are a strong board presence in the early game and work well with close air support to buff something into a massive threat, especially with Hurricane MK, which offers high burst potential with its Fury ability. Another important piece of this deck is Empire Strikes, which offers a cheap AoE that scales with the number of bombers you have and also damages the enemy headquarters. The buff to counter offensive has turned this previously unplayed card into the core combo piece of the best deck currently in the game. This deck uses cheap units and bounce effects to build up a ton of tempo in the early game, and usually aims to finish around turn 7 with a Winter Warfare plus counter-offensive combo to create a massive unit. This deck snowballs incredibly quickly and gets stronger the further ahead you are on board, while being able to burst the starting health total from hand. Without board control, it can be difficult to win when playing from behind, but it's not impossible if you can run your opponent low on cards. Because counteroffensive requires being played on a tank or infantry, you do need frontline control to win. The best single deck against this is Soviet-US artillery deck because of anti-tank gun and Petlikov, but even that is only slightly favored against counteroffensive. The US-Soviet version offers significantly higher tempo plays than the other versions of the deck with Sherman and Bounce, as well as many powerful, cheap units to guarantee early board domination. Soviet-US is stronger against aggressive classes because of 456th Rifle Regiment, but is often knocked out after a single board clear against control. German-Soviet is also a contender with more blitz tanks to buff, but can't compete at the same level because of the lack of card draw. The key combo of this deck is Winter Warfare plus counteroffensive to create an either unkillable unit or to immediately win the game. M4 Sherman is important to refill your hand, and M4A1 is often the best target for counteroffensive because it is unable to be targeted by orders such as Blade of the Samurai. Combined with cards like 99th Infantry Battalion and M16 Half-Track, this deck has amazing tempo potential, getting through guards or buff units, no contest.
Thank you again, Admiral, for taking the time to chat with me. I look forward to seeing you in your casting debut in just a few moments here with KARDS. Before we get into that, let me take you quickly through the bracket of the top 4 and who you're going to see competing tonight for the $1,000 prize pool. In the top half of the bracket tonight, you're going to see Ari Big Ben take on Spoos. Ari defeated Rafkin 2-1 in his quarterfinal matchup, and we had Spoos defeat Hayes 2-1 in his quarterfinal matchup. That's going to pit Spoos and Ari head to head. Now taking a look at the bottom half of the bracket, we have J King against John PX. J King defeated Non-GMO Salt 2-1. Non-GMO Salt, stellar handle, I love it. John PX defeated 2 Die is Gain 2-0 in his semifinal match, and that will complete your top 4 that you're going to see in a few moments. Cast once again by Flake and Admirable. But before we get to that, I want to highlight the fact that we've had a lot of fun with Blitz. We've had fun with Singleton before that, but we're going back to our traditional Cards Open on April 3rd. Don't miss your opportunity to sign up for it. Registration will open a little bit later this week. Another $1,000 on the line in that event. So thank you so much for tuning in to the War Room. I will see you all next time. Over to you, Flake and Admirable.
the ever so bearded. Again, I feel so out of place. I just saw your amazing interview with Christo, Admirable, and I am the one. Apparently, I have donated all my facial hair to the two of you. You look much more coiffed. You look really well here, my friend. But it is Monday Night Blitz here for Cards, and I am so happy that I am joined with you. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing fantastic. You know, I've been playing cards all morning. You and I have been playing cards a lot this morning as well. Had to take a break in there to do my hair at some point, but I am stoked to see some tournament play. I have been loving cards. It's something that I really like about this game is that the decks are so thematic and they feel so powerful. And that's one of the great things that I like about card games and tournaments in general, is that people try to bring the most powerful stuff they can to show it off, to absolutely stomp their opponents and try to do the best they can to win. And that's what we got here today. We got the top 4 who are trying their best to win these matches and come away with their share of $1,000.
Yeah, and they've been trying their best for several days now. Between March 16th and March 19th were 4 days of qualifiers. There were something like 30 different brackets that players were vying for to get their way through to getting to this. Where we are now here on this this final day where we're going to be taking care of the top 4, but overall about 150 unique players all were testing their mettle here and getting the trading blows to get to where we are right now for $1,000 USD. And it's worth noting, though this player is not going to be appearing here on the top 4 broadcast, but Rafkin I think played almost every single bracket and actually made it through on the final one. So props to Rafkin. Didn't quite get all the way there, but that is some serious guts and chutzpah, if you would, to get to where we are today. But Admirable, I mean, it's more than just money. There's some pride on the line. How about we take a look at the bracket and see who made it here, where it's all going to go down.
In our top 4, we have J King, John PX, Ari Big Ben, and Spoos. And if you could take a look and see where the names, they have been defeated. Their names are highlighted if you take a look across the bracket. And as Flake said, this was multiple days of tournament play that went through this. Players were engaging in flights that were between 8 and 16 players. If you came away the winner of one of those flights, you then qualified for the Blitz 32, which is what we have set up here right now. So focus in on that center, that top 4 that's right there. Those are the matches that we're going to be looking at, and we also have to have our 3rd and 4th place match, which will be taking place underneath. It's the only opportunity that you have in this tournament to lose a match and still get to compete for something. It's if you're in that top 4, because we have to decide who the 3rd and 4th place finishers are.
And they are fighting for, obviously, some cash money here, some bling bling, but everybody who did take place in the qualifier tournaments to get to this top 32, the top 16 and all the way through, there were gold prizes awarded to all those players, courtesy of the fine people at Cards CCG. But the real cheddar is what they're going to be playing for here today, which is all top 4 are going to be splitting a prize pool of $1,000 of them delicious American greenbacks, my friend. Now, this is Monday Night Blitz, Admirable, and I just want to ask you real quick, if you know, now I am representing the Great White North. There is no Canadian representation in Cards. I know that it's all good. You yourself are just a wonderful beacon of Americana, my friend. But do you know the differences between American football and Canadian football?
One of them is American and one of them is Canadian. That's about the only difference I know, though.
That
I
is
know literally nothing about Canadian football.
That is absolutely correct. Now, number 1, the field is bigger. Number 2, there are only 3 downs instead of 4. But number 3, bigger balls. That is absolutely true. Canadians have bigger balls when it comes to football. That is, it's the truth. It is the absolute truth. Check the rule book. Speaking of rule books, Admirable, there's some little caveats about this particular broadcast.
Oh, and what are those? Can you go ahead and guide me through them? I'm kind of curious about the rules themselves, because as far as I understood, the rules were quite vague coming into this Blitz tournament.
Well, you know what? They were so vague, we threw them right out the freaking window. Absolutely. Basically, the game of American baseball has over 170 pages of rules. This particular tournament, out the door. No rules at all. Well, not technically, but your typical rules regarding how the decks in the conquest format, etc., don't apply here. Each player will bring basically 2 to 3 decks of their choice. There is no banning. There is no conquest format in which if a deck wins, it is no longer eligible to play. It is just you show up, you play, and we'll see how it shakes out. Because a lot of these decks were actually mysteries to the players themselves, obviously, and the opponents, but to us as well as broadcasters. We only really got to take a quick peek at them, and these are all going to be really surprising and fun for us to cast, because it's going to be kind of out of left field how some of these cards appear and such. So a good variety of the decks, though, from what we took a look at.
Yeah, if you kind of go over it and look through the matches, so we have Ari Big Ben and Spoos coming up in the first match. There were 5 different decks available in this one, and we kind of took a look through them and to see like how they were contrasting and what the objectives of these decks were. And there's a lot of clashing that's going on. Even when players are playing the same nations in their deck, what's happening is they're taking very different approaches to it. And that's something that I've really liked about cards in general, is that the cards are very powerful. It's nothing so absurdly powerful that you kind of look at it and be like, this needs to be changed, at least not in an individual card. It's always when it's combined with something else that's available in the game that you start to experience these, well, wait a second, that's about the strongest thing that I've experienced in quite a long time. And throughout the course of time, those kinds of decks will take over. People will play them because winning is typically a little bit more fun than not winning. And so when we look at these decks throughout the course of this, there's so many powerful things that are happening across the board that almost every single one of these decks had something different that it was offering. And to me, that was one of the most interesting spots of it, is that there were no limitations on what players had to bring. And so as a result of that, they're kind of flexing all over and showing which decks that they're most comfortable with, which ones they think are most powerful, and which ones are perhaps least expected by their opponents. I think those are 3 big factors that come into it and kind of centerpiece you if you are going to be winning this tournament at this point.
And variety really is what the key point to not really drive home here, is the fact that between Ari Big Ben and Spoos, the first matchup that we're going to be seeing here, there are 5 main factions you can choose from, and of those 5 decks, all 5 factions, main factions, are represented. You have a main USA, main Soviet, main Britain, main Japan, main Germany. You even have some Italy involved in one of these decks, so I won't spoil which one. Hopefully we get to see it, but I think that we're about ready to rock and roll here, my friend. It is time for the first of the semifinals here between Ari Big Ben and Spoos. Ari Big Ben of Norway versus Spoos representing Germany. So again, Ari Big Ben is the only player here to bring 3 decks. Spoos opting to bring 2, as we can see here. This is match number 1, my friend. It is going to be Japan by Spoos. Looking at that would be Britain by Ari Big Ben.
Yeah, and if you take a look across the board for that one, again, I'm going to be referencing their decks quite a bit because this, I think, tells some big details about what's going to be happening and what to be expecting in these matches, and then where things are going to be contrasting and changing up a bit. For Spoos, it's the Japan and Soviet deck that has been brought here, and it really features the ever-present combo that you continue to face if you are plowing through a lot of games on ladder. It's the winter warfare and counter-offensive combo. And I think it's been introduced into a pretty interesting spot here with Japan, because Japan is, pretty wholeheartedly an aggressive deck for the most part. There's an order control deck that kind of floats around a bit, but for the most part, it's aggression that I have typically faced against when I'm playing against Japan. And so when you introduce winter warfare and counter-offensive into that, there's now a new element and a new layer of danger that you have to account for when you're playing against this sort of thing. Right here, already, you're starting to see a little bit of contrast with that. You being able to use the winter warfare just to draw a card from 33rd Recon, I think that's a big deal. You hop over to the Britain-Germany deck on Ari Big Ben's side, and this is a deck that is featuring the Commonwealth. That is pretty much the telltale everything of the deck. If your headquarters has 30 or more defense, you deal 20 to the enemy headquarters. That is the sole factor of the deck, is stay alive, dig through the deck, find the Commonwealth, and win the game through that.
And looking at these deck lists again, we, as you mentioned there, Japan being a very overly aggressive, lots of low to the ground units that would be able to just kind of flood onto the field. But, not to be outdone, Ari Big Ben with the Commonwealth as one of the win conditions available. Obviously, Royal Research can sort of get you there if you need it as well. But just lots of damage mitigation, a lot of problem-solving, life gain, which is going to be a real thorn in the side for Spoos, because these Japanese aggro decks, even though you do have the potential to use a counteroffensive off of a board that has been, peppered with some damage here and there, you really only get 1 or 2 big swings, and you're playing against a deck that really capitalizes on making these trades, punishing those units, removing them, and just constantly just racking up that health total. As you can see here, it has just been a few turns, and suddenly the board has just really rocketed back and forth. And a 5/5 infantry on the front row is guarded. That HQ is guarded so nicely by a 4/7 guard, those commandos, that number 1 commando in the front row, that trades up with anything that it deals damage to. So a nice line of defense there for Ari Big Ben.
Yeah, it's kind of a tough spot that I think that Spoos is finding himself in here. You know, this is one of the main factors, I'd say, for the Commonwealth deck, is just to defend itself very efficiently. And Seaforth Highlander is one of the greatest cards, I think, to do that in terms of cost to what you get for it. It's a 4-credit card, and it's a 1/7 body on your turn. That's okay. You're not really dedicated to attacking. That's not really your prime plan. On your opponent's turn, it is a 4/7 guard. That is huge. And when you're an aggressive deck, you have to chew through this somehow. So you kind of take a look at, you know, what's on Spoos' side and what he's choosing to do with this. To me, the big one is that he's had to use the Sendai Regiment to take care of the #1 commando, or he's not going to have a counteroffensive on the front line that's going to be able to threaten it all. And so that's, I think, one of the biggest factors that Spoos has run into this game is that already Sendai Regiment has had to be used on something that he's not considering a primary target for that card, eliminating a guard and then smacking for a bunch of damage.
Seeing as well as you did have those 34th Infantry Regiment that they do at the end of the turn remove the top card from the game, and they did hit the 35th Mountain Rifles, which is basically the home run you're looking for to get that unit cheated out if possible. And
aptly named as well, 34th into 35th.
That's it. It's just perfect. It flows so well. And there's the counteroffensive that we're talking about. Bloody Sickle is going to make it short work of that Flampanzer in the back row. That is a nice card to pick up as well. Go ahead and refill the hand. That is something that these aggressive lists that like to dump all their low-cost units onto the board really need to capitalize on, is get those card draws in when you can. As you can see there, an 11-6, the counteroffensive deck is coming through. And despite the fact that you did hit the Flampanzers properly, you did have all the defenses there, you had the guard, Spoos still managing with these, you know, these sort of small plays that really start to snowball with things like counteroffensive, winter warfare, etc. As you can see there, an 11-6 on the front row, which has just been pinned. But I mean, it's still a threat in the front row.
It's a really tough position here as Spoos draws the 3rd counteroffensive now. And I'm actually not super sure this is a great draw, but it doesn't seem like it's a bad one right now. He's got a 6-6 on front line that's able to attack right now. That's already a big deal. Sexton comes down, it pins down the 35th that's already had counteroffensive buffed on it. And so now you look at Spoos' side, he goes, well, wait a second, neither of these units got taken care of. I'm just going to buff these up and say, here, you deal with it at this point. And on Ari Big Ben's side, these have to be dealt with, and they have to be dealt with pretty much right away. If they are not, this game is going to end because there's just so much damage cranked on that front line already.
That's it. I mean, you're basically spreading a little bit of that damage through. You know, you're diversifying that damage portfolio, if you will, as you both 35ths now are kind of packing really mean punches. Those are 2 haymakers that you're gonna have to at least dodge one of those if you want to walk to the next bout here, or get to the next turn even. And at this case, you know, it's going to be an interesting situation, but shelling, dealing 1 damage to all enemy units and pinning them. That is Spoos coming in with the, are you kidding me? And the 7th defense, this is what Ari wants to do, obviously, is he wants to get that life total up, but that just bought him 1 more turn. So he still is really hunting for a little bit of options as he's staring down basically 1-off lethal from that front row.
Yeah, it certainly feels a lot more dangerous from Spoos' end. You saw him drop the "Are you kidding me?" When that shelling came down. It just really, for Ari Big Ben, it's about just, it gets an extra turn from this one. But each draw, it can do so much. And in this spot, already a lot is happening. Root out the enemy gets drawn as well. That's going to wipe out the Sendai Regiment, which went to the front line to draw those 2 cards from Rising Sun. That was a risk that Spoos opted to take from that, and I think rightfully so. Neither of his big threats have been handled. The Sendai Regiment hadn't been handled. Why not draw those 2 cards with it? It's clear your opponent cannot remove it directly. So that gets back the #1 commando now. There's a guard in play with that Black Watch, and suddenly you're looking at Spoos' side, and it doesn't look so easy anymore. He's got 1 big clock, but Ari Big Ben's up to 26 defense on the headquarters right now. I think this could be a bit of a problem for Spoos right now because he opted to keep his 2/2s in hand as well. You look at those 34th infantry regiments that have been in hand. He opted to keep those to keep them safe from AoE clear, something like carpet bombing being drawn, for instance. And again, rightfully so. He's had enough threats in play. Why just add more to the board to get swept away if your opponent draws the right card? But now you look at this situation, and suddenly Ari Big Ben is looking like is smooth sailing from here. There's not a ton on Spoos' side that's going to have giant threats at this point. And Ari Big Ben has got an answer to 1 right now, and he's got defense against the others in hand. I think this has turned into a very difficult game for Spoos at this point.
Well, Spoos had an opportunity early on. He threatened, close to lethal at a certain element just by the board presence that he had. The problem there was the fact that, well, at a certain
Ooh,
there's a big one
desperate
too.
measures drawn.
That is a huge draw right off Bloody Sickle that does take care of the number 1 commando that was really going to trade up with that 10-3 and, give Ari some life here. However, he is at 13 health. He has already gained 14 health, so he has already cheated death once, and he's digging for more help here as he's looking. There's carpet bombing. That's going to save the day a little bit, at least give him a little bit more breath of life, as once again, Spoos has to go ahead and recreate a board and another threatening situation that that Ari Big Ben could probably just circumnavigate if necessary.
Yeah, for Spoos at this point, though, it is a little bit of an opening. He gets to finally develop these 2/2s. He draws Rising Sun. If these manage to stay around for the next turn, he gets to clock for 7. Ari Big Ben has to check everything pretty much the rest of the game. And another root out the enemy. He's drawn so many board clears, Flake.
And just the honey. Is that the honey or is that no? That would be.
Oh, that's the honey.
That is the honey. And we're gonna draw 2 cards. We're gonna gain some life. You know what? Let's just draw some more cards. Why the hell not? Gain some life. This guy has. You know what? He just health for days, defense for days for that HQ, and we're gonna put that one away as well. Let's tuck that under the rug. And and now it's just looking real difficult for Spoos to come back.
Yeah, I mean that was a devastating pan of draws that Ari Big Ben got there, and that's the reason you put board clears in your deck when you're a control deck, but you don't necessarily expect them to show up one right after another, right after another, right after another. A couple pieces of card draw, using your best to defend yourself. You're hoping that you get those cards. The reason they're in your deck, but for Spoos at this point, it's just crumbled apart. He has almost no hope to get there at this point.
And it's amazing because Spoos was using those counter offensives so early, presenting these monuments of infantry in the front row, 13 damage, 8 damage, 9 damage, and just dancing around it. Ari Big Ben has found those sort of margins just to get forward. As you can see, the board is just clear. There is nothing. That's a nice pickup, but it might be a little bit too late as you have really no board presence. Those Rising Sun are just burning holes in your pocket as a bombing run there is really not going to help you out.
I got to give credit to Spoos in this one. I think there were 2 really key factors that you can note that explains the experience in this matchup, but also just the experience with the deck in general. First, for me, was the counter offensives and taking the risks on just medium-sized counter offensives. +4/+4 on each one. They presented massive threats over to Ari Big Ben's side. They had to be checked or the game was going to end in that spot. I think that's already a big credit towards Spoos. He put up a threat that was necessary in order to get this game rolling. Number 2, though, was holding on to those 34th Infantry regiments until he saw board clears take place and then get him down to try and draw those cards from Rising Sun. They got checked right away because of the draws from Ari Big Ben. But I think overall for this one, it's a big credit to Spoos on this one. He really understands the dynamic of this aggressive deck and what you have to do to both put your opponent in trouble and try to keep yourself out of overcommitting with stuff. Those are 2 very difficult skills, I think, to develop when you're starting out playing card games.
Well, Ari Big Ben, he weathered the storm early in this one, and it's down to game 2 over here. He's up 1-0 in this series, 1-3. Takes it. Now you can play the same deck over and over again, should you choose. So we're going to see how this responds as we see as Spoos is going to be using his Germany as a main nation with USA as support against Ari Big Ben, who has come in with USA and an Italian counterpart to go ahead and lead him into battle against Spoos. And we go ahead and a quick drop and a quick just a quick assault, just to let him know, knock on the door, tell him he's there.
Yeah, I really liked this deck from Ari Big Ben when I first saw it. It was the USA with Italy as the ally on this one. And initially when I kind of looked at it, I was like, I've really only experienced Italy being a very aggressive build, but there's been a couple of introductions into the game recently, and it's kind of given it this dynamic where it can play a very mid-range heavy deck, which is, to me, kind of a beautiful sight. I love mid-range decks because they decide to take the aggressive stance or the defensive stance based on the matchup that they are in and the situation that they are in, not necessarily just from the sole point of their deck to start with. And I think that's really one of the biggest ones to look at, is when that happens. So when you take a look at this deck list across, I think one of the big ones that stands out to me is the Marty Nostrums, that he has 3 copies of the deck. It gives a unit +1/+1, and it says damage dealt by this unit adds that defense to your headquarters. It doesn't seem like much, but when that card gets churning, it can absolutely put the game out of reach for your opponent. And so the big one here is play cards that are attritioning your opponent. They remain nominal threats, and at some point be able to completely stabilize yourself from the threat of your opponent. You look over at Spooz's side, and I really liked the deck list here as well. Using Germany with USA as the ally. Again, this was a pretty aggressive deck. You know, he caps out at 5 cost. For the cards that are there, and it's really, really leaning heavily on Fast Heinz being a tremendous threat if you can get some frontline presence in here. Giving your German tanks +2/+1 while they're in the front line for just a single credit is a very big card, and it can be a very big threat. Not only that, but the tanks, they're just very efficient at staying alive and presenting a threat to your opponent. So I think for Spooz in this matchup, you look at the life total and it feels like it can be very out of reach, but just one quick Fast Heinz and bam, tons of damage starts cranking out.
And there you go. Being above 40 HQ defense on the HQ means nothing now, as you're staring down this front line of just metal aggression, absolute blitzing to the front line. I mean, War Bonds is a great card to have to just put you over the top in terms of your credit max. You're drawing extra cards, but you have nothing else really to do over here, as all of that cushion that you just built up is now evaporated as these tanks are just chewing away at you at the front line. You need to respond here, and it's worth noting that Fast Heinz give your German tanks in the front line +2/+1. That's forever, Admirable. That's forever. That stuff sticks with you forever like luggage. You're gonna
That's what
hang
helps
on
you
to
catch
that.
up.
Absolutely. As you can see, those tanks over there are aggressive as hell, and they're getting the job done. That's what's so great about these German lists that run this type of blitz heavy tank sort of armada of this fleet of tanks, because you can drop them and go ahead and get aggressive in the front row right out of the gate. So you're going to be holding the front line, you're going to be pushing the tempo, and for Ari, who's running a deck really that's looking to just max out and ramp as far as he can. You can see he's at 14 credits, but it seems like he's just way too far behind, as another tank just comes out and straight to face. That one just rifled through. That was a quick game, and Spooz takes this one on the back of a very aggressive tank list. Ari, Big Ben, and Spooz tied 1 apiece over here. As you can see, game 1 went to Ari. Spooz took game 2. This is it. This is the final deciding game. This is it, Admirable, and it's going to be, are we going to see any type of reverting back to some old favorites?
Yeah, we're seeing Ari Big Ben go back over to the Britain-Germany deck that got him the first game. I think that given what he's seen from Spooz at this point, you're anticipating something aggressive, but something a bit more resilient than you had faced the last time. And that's really something I think to consider, is that in game number 1 against the Japan-Soviet deck that Ari Big Ben was facing, the deck was fairly resilient, but Ari got a chain of draws that just absolutely wiped the board on Spooz's side. So Spooz has swapped now over to this Germany tank deck and is trying to just get a foothold of cards in play that then suddenly your opponent is threatened by them because of their presence. You know, cards like Fast Heinz, the threat of its power is part of its power. Your opponent can't just let you get a fleet or an armada of tanks, as you had so eloquently put it just a moment ago. Those need to be wiped right away. And so when that happens, what that means is Spooz isn't having to invest those buffs in order to get board clears from Ari Big Ben's side. It means that the cards themselves are threatening enough that Spooz gets to have the board cleared and just keep those buffs in hand. They're very few, but they're very important. And so kind of looking at that matchup, I think that he's right to stick with it. And on Ari Big Ben's side, I think he's right to swap back to the common health deck as well, because I think it's just going to do a better job of holding off the aggression from Spooz's side. It's meant to be doing that. I don't think this is a spot necessarily to pick a mid-range deck unless you were just unexpected of what your opponent could play. But I think it's given 2 games in a row here, he's pretty confident that having a more controlling deck is probably going to be the best way to counteract what Spooz is doing.
And just to note, there is a minor technical difficulty regarding the hands there, but that's just because it makes it that much more interesting and exciting. The suspense is real. It's thick. It's palpable. It's viscous. It's there. As we can see now, there's a little bit of help coming to that M4 in the front row in the form of a 109th Combat Engineers that have just given a little bit of an extra edge as it goes forward, and bouncing that card with the 99th Infantry Battalion sort of allows for that tank to, get a chance to establish itself. There is a guard there now, but that is a big card. Cannot be targeted by enemy orders. Heavy Armor 1 Panther G is a massive, dangerous card when you cannot just point, click, and delete it the way that you might want to.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of danger going on here for Ari Big Ben's side, and this is kind of the idea that I was getting at here, is that if you look at this Germany USA tanks deck with the Fast Hinds as I'd say its trait mechanism of what the deck's trying to do, a lot of these cards just can't be targeted by orders, and so that means they have to be answered by units instead. And I think that was one of the highlights for me from Ari Big Ben's side, is that you look at the number 1 commando, which any damage it deals is enough to kill the unit. It only deals 1 damage, but that's enough to kill it. I think that cheap answer is a great way to counter stuff like this, but that's where cards like the 99th come in, is that they can just put them back in hand if you have control of the front line. And that's the whole point of Spooz's deck, is to get these tanks in the front line and start cranking out some damage. So I think that Ari Big Ben is in a bit of trouble given what I'm seeing right now, but I think that there's a very high probability that answers can be gotten here. The number 1's still there to threaten this, and in order to get through this 4-7 right now, Spooz is going to have to invest some board. And when you start investing in board, that starts weakening that board and starts making the board clear potential that much more dangerous. So I think that accounting for that and figuring out where this is going to go and how much of a risk you can take, I'd say that is one of the weaknesses of this, is it doesn't have quite as much fuel as the Japan aggro deck had, where it's able to just burn through its deck because it's drawing so many cards. This is more weighted in the idea that just your cards are individually stronger, but that's not necessarily better versus board clear. So I think this is a bit of trouble for Spoos, but given the power of the deck, I think it's still kind of anyone's game.
This is a matchup here where Ari Big Ben is perfectly fine just not being the aggressor or engaging in the actual trades. If there's a trade that he wants to take, obviously they'll take it here, but Ari Big Ben probably wants to be spending those credits more so on developing his own win condition, getting that health up above 30 for Commonwealth to pop off if necessary, as well as just perhaps walking down the path of research if necessary. As you can see right now, the board is overwhelmingly tipped in Spooz's favor, but taking the trades where necessary by exchanging that number 1 commando into that M4, I mean, that's a fair trade that you want to take. But as we can see here, Sudden Strike will get rid of the 99th in the front row, and it's once again going to go and switch back to Spooz as the daylight bombing gets hit, and will take care of the engineers in the back row, costing a credit too, if I'm not mistaken. And there's Bolster's another card that I wanted to mention that Spooz is running here, because that is such an ideal matchup. What a beautiful pair, because now that tank operates for free, gets a little extra sauce on that pasta, and we're gonna go ahead and make short work of that defender. The guard is now laid waste, and that is a intimidating tank on the front lines.
Yeah, I want to give a shout out here to the Panzer 3F that's in the back, though. It's one of the newer cards that was introduced. It says deployment, your other tanks get +1 +1, and it has Blitz itself, and it says your German tanks have Blitz. That is a card that's introduced that really changes how you look at how you want to build a centralized unit with Germany. And tanks certainly get highlighted because of the Panzer 3F. It is a special card, so you can only have 2 copies of it, but it does a lot of work for 1 card. The fact that it's a 3-credit 3/3, already pretty reasonable. It's got Blitz on there. It's, operation cost isn't the greatest, but it's putting a buff across the rest of your board. And before that bolster was drawn on Spooz's side, that tank that he had sitting in the back was still a threat to that 4-7 that was on the opposite end. And so that alone was a huge deal. And then suddenly pincer given to the 10-6 that's in play. That's the end of the game. That's enough damage very quickly to end a spot like that. And that's one of the things that I love about cards, is that every single individual unit feels like a big threat because of how it gets enabled by something else. That to me is one of my favorite parts about this game. Everything feels like a threat.
And as you can see over there, how things can change. I mean, even just by testament of that first match that we saw, where Spoos was just pressuring with 2 massive units, 2 massive Japanese infantry units that were just buffed up through that winter warfare, through the counter offensive buffing, and just managing to actually navigate through. There was a lot of back and forth, but to your words there, my friend, the fact that Spoos made it through on such brilliant back and forth play there, and the fact that you jam a massive tank that can't be targeted by orders, you hit it with bolster, you move to the front, get rid of the guard, and suddenly you just get that fury going, and it is that's all she wrote. The German tanks and their aggression, their ability to deploy, move to the front row, and be aggressive right out of the box is nothing to shake a stick at, and that has led Spoos, relying again on that German deck, to go ahead and 2-1 Ari Big Ben. Any notable plays that you want to talk about there, Admirable? Anything that sort of caught your eye from that previous match?
For me, I want to look at the third game and really draw the highlight there, which was the patience from Spoos and relying on Panzer IIIF to bolster the board, before the bolster got drawn. The big one to look at was the Seaforth Highlanders, which were defending the headquarters for our Big Ben side in such a grand way. An overinvestment from Spoos' side would have resulted in just carpet bombing, being able to completely clear out everything. Instead, he took his time, he was very patient with it, and he just buffed his units. He had a 7 attack tank sitting there waiting to crank through that as soon as he had a reasonable opportunity for damage. Part of that also, though, opened up the opportunity to just draw more powerful cards. The bolster got drawn. That made the tank huge. And then right afterwards, the 5th Panzer Grenadier gets drawn, gives it fury, ends the game. I think that patience that's been demonstrated right there kind of ties back into the first game that I was talking about, where it was just the patience from Spoos and the understanding of when you unleash the rest of your cards as an aggressive deck that really makes a difference in that spot. It looks like it's something very little, but it takes a lot of experience to develop that notion.
Well, and there you go. Spoos going through, riding on the back of a tank all the way, blitzing his way through till the finals. Spoos has defeated Ari Big Ben. Ari Big Ben, representing a deck I know that you have a lot of fondness for. The Commonwealth is a card that I know that you and I have had many discussions about how awesome it is. And it's unfortunate we didn't get to see it pop off. However, Ari Big Ben, I was confident enough in that deck to bring it here, and it did pop off a win. Not in the most spectacular fireworks way we might have hoped for, but not bad right out of the box today to go ahead and watch this first matchup, the semifinals, won by Spoos 2-1 against Ari Big Ben. And we're going to go ahead and cut to a really, really brief break, ladies and gentlemen. So go ahead and do the old stretching, get some water, hydrate yourself. We'll be back in short order with the next semifinal match between J King and John PX. It's Monday Night Blitz here at KARDS CCG. I am Flake. I'm joined by Admirable. Now, I have a little bone to pick with you, my friend. Now, just below our, this little frame of which we live in, this little sort of box of existential crisis that we live in, there's our name. Below that is our Twitter coordinates. Below that is our rarity, our worth, if you will. Why is it that you are elite and I am but a four of common peasant? I don't understand.
Well, how many of you exist?
Well, that's worth wondering. It's the multiverse. Like, it's when Doctor Strange just kind of split, and he was thinking about all the different existences, all the different realities, four of which I exist in, none of which I defeat Thanos. But it's all good because Spoos defeated Ari Big Ben in the first semifinals rather matchup, and we do have another semifinals. So why don't you lead us through this bracket, my friend?
Yeah, you take a look at the bracket and you can see the players highlighted the matchups that they went through in order to get to this top 4 points. Again, to emphasize this, these were flights that took place where the winners of the flights throughout this week qualified for the Blitz 32. And so what you're looking at here is you're looking at a bracket of players who qualified through that mechanism. It wasn't just this particular spot they had to win. They had to win another spot as well. And there were tons of players that played throughout the course of that. It was over 150 players that were unique, as well as the fact that players were re-entering it to try to get those card game tournaments rolling time and time again. And that, to me, that's such an exciting part about this whole ordeal, is that this was an open tournament. To me, that's a big part about card games. And I'd say like in the digital card game universe right now, open tournaments have been a very desired thing, but they necessarily haven't been a very active thing. I want to say it's been kind of weird, but I love to see it this way. The open tournaments are the best ones because anyone can compete in them, and that's the beauty of card games, is that everything is level to start with. You have to earn your way through this, and it's the experience and it's the prior mechanisms and then a little bit of luck that's involved alongside the gameplay that really makes a difference once you get down to a point like this one. So looking at the top 4, I talked a lot in the first match about Spoos and some of the particular highlights about his play that I think really stood out to me, and I'm hoping I can see the same ones here, because we got J King versus John PX that's in this next one, and I've been looking at the deck lists and they look fantastic to me. They look very clean, and I'm excited to see how this matchup pans out.
I know, we're looking at J King representing Canada and John PX of Belarus. They will be scoring off here in the semifinals. And again, when we were going through these deck lists, there was a lot. We were taking notes and just looking through all the peculiarities of them. And it's worth noting, just in the previous matchup, that very much maligned and often thorn in the people's side of counter-offensive did not win the matchup that it was featured in. So rest assured, maybe it needs a buff even, as we all cry for it to be nerfed. But no, don't quote me on that, dear God, no.
Down to 1 credit, +3/+3.
Yeah, why not? Let's make that the thing. We'll be the bad guys here. We'll talk to the developers. We'll make sure that that's the next thing that happens at the next patch. Dear God, save us all. We are going into the next matchup, which is J King versus John PX. And J King bringing a Soviet deck with USA support, Britain with a German support, and John PX is bringing a German with British support and a Britain with USA support, as we see the beautiful flags of Canada and Belarus. And it's first to 2 wins here, J King versus John. And we're going to see what they bring to the table right out of the gate. John PX is going to be representing that would be Britain with USA in the backfield, and Britain with Germany helping out for J King. So a little tea time over here. It's high time for a little tea and crumpets here at KARDS Blitz.
Yeah, no cup of teas involved in either of these lists, unfortunately. But when you take a look at them, there are, I'd say, some pretty distinct differences in just the way that they are built. I want to say that on J King's side, I'm a little bit worried about this matchup. It's mostly like a control type of build with, a lot of board sweeps that are taking place in here and a lot of reactive cards that are just happening in general on J King's side. When you look at John PX's side, and this list is not messing around. It is very heavy. There's ramp that's involved with this deck, and then you look at the top end, and it just cranks out some threats. It's got 2 Grenadier Guards, it's got 2 TBF-1 Avengers, and it's got a B-17 Flying Fortress in it. So J King has got his work cut out for him if they're going to be answering these threats that eventually come up on John PX's side. And that's really what I'm worried about here, is that it's mostly the research that's getting the job done on J King's side. And if that research can't absolutely put him in a spot to close this game, I think that there's a bit of worry for me.
Well, let's just evaluate the credit situation right now. John PX is sitting on 6 credits bank, going up to 7 next turn. He's already 3 credits effectively ahead of J King right now. And looking at the ramp, John PX is really packing it in terms of ramp. You've got the 2x War Machine. You have Carrier Cover, which can be used again to ramp as well as 3x War Bonds. So he wants to race to, like you said, those bigger boys, the TBF-1 Avenger, the Flying Fortress, being able to have access to things like carpet bombing sooner than you might expect. Filling up the hand with Lend-Lease, Lancaster's in there as well, the Lancaster B3. So you have a lot of big threats that you can get out and cheat out early by really running down that ramp, as you can see right now, taking out the Honey, going ahead, establishing a guard on the back row, and John PX is already, reaping the benefits of that early game ramp.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Lend-Lease. We can see a copy of John PX's hand, but there are 2 copies of Lend-Lease that are in this deck for John PX. 2 copies of Lend-Lease. It's very difficult to run Lend-Lease if your opponent's playing an aggressive deck. You don't really have time to just draw 4 cards and then hope that you get to use them. You've had to diffuse the board situation at that point. And that to me kind of highlights what I was talking about, where on J King's side, there's just really not a lot of threat that's coming from J King's side. And so what that means is John PX has time to use all these heavy costed cards and leverage those against J King. It doesn't really matter what the threats are. J King does have to answer threats. And same thing for John PX as well. But there's just really not the same amount of threat pressure on J King's side. You take a look at the top end of this one. There's a Lancaster B3, there's a Panther A, there's a Mosquito. The rest of it's kind of disruption and answers. And so a lot of this damage just has to be chipped away on J King's side.
Big hit with the MI5 getting rid of the expanded reach, putting it back, but there's another one. Comes right back. And this is what we're talking about in terms of the ability and the benefits of ramping way ahead of your opponent over here. Is John PX has a 3 credit advantage. You get to find those opportunities to go ahead and expand that research and run down that path all the way to a potential win condition, as we see with our good friend, the Bletchley Park, if I'm not mistaken, as we go ahead and continue to expand that research. And like you and I, we were talking about this yesterday, is the fact that those research cards that exist for the US, that exist for Germany, for Britain, these are in themselves big win conditions, but they're not just the fact that you have to invest, a ton of mana. I say mana. What I mean is a man. I'm thinking here. A credit
of a bank, to get credits.
Yeah. A mana war is what I'm saying. A mana war is when you're investing those credits into stuff like, having that big credit advantage. You'll be able to go ahead and cheat those out. And there's Lend-Lease, comes back, fills up the hand. An M18 Hellcat is a nice card to play, but in this case, you can just drop it there. It is protected by that guard if necessary. But lurking in the hand there, my friend Admirable, is C. Montgomery Burns.
It's not really doing too much in this matchup. That's a card that's meant to just kind of diffuse your opponent's side of things, buy you a little bit of time, and just end up, drawing a card from that spot. It's going to get a use here, though, because on John PX's side, really not efficient credit use, and it's not any fault of John's side. John PX has just had a fairly clunky, inefficient hand for the goal that they're trying to accomplish right now, which is get the research unlocked. It costs a lot of credits to do that. Like, before you play Bletchley Park, 15 credits get invested just in 2 phases of this. The initial one, it's 3. It's not a big deal. You play it, whatever. You get a 6-1 in your hand. You play a 6, you play a 9. Then you have to play a 12. There's a ton of credits that have to go into this. And because there's really no threats being lined up on either side, what's happening here is that John PX has spent so much time drawing cards and just getting things developed that suddenly J King's starting to put together a board that's looking a little bit dangerous from John PX's side. And so I imagine here, you see him thumbing the carpet bombing at this point. I think this is rightfully so, because if you don't diffuse some of this board situation, what can happen is that Seaforth Highlander gets answered, and suddenly you're taking like 11 damage, and you're on defense the rest of the game. And that's not where you want to be with a deck that's quite as greedy as the way that John PX's has been built. He wants to just keep the board even, so that way his plays are the ones leveraging that power potential that's there. So I think smart to kind of keep that clear and make J King have to redo this whole thing that's been going on. So there's the Royal Research from J King's side. That's where their credits, I think, are going to start be cranking towards to threaten John PX.
That's right. Jay King's going to school as well and doing his research to get ahead and maybe get to Bletchley Park on his own. And now in this case, the Flying Fortress comes out. It doesn't quite hit maybe what it wanted to hit, though that isn't a bad one to do, as well as the Bombers do have the ability to go ahead and dish damage without taking it back. There is no more fighter in the back line preventing it, but there's one right now. And
every time I see Monty, I just picture you talking about C. Montgomery Burns with this one.
Absolutely. He's Springfield's oldest man. It's Monty Burns, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, that card is probably a depiction of Monty Burns from, the age that's been given from that point. But, kind of looking again at the board and where things are floating, it's really just a matter of dancing back and forth until one of them takes a major step with something.
And there it is.
Ultra being drawn. Now, that's a card that can really throw a loop for things where every single turn, John PX has been floating 3 credits. And when you play those countermeasures, your opponent doesn't see that you spend those credits. It's visible on your end, but all your opponent sees is that you did not spend those credits. So there's always a threat of a countermeasure that's come into place. And so because John PX, this is a really interesting note, because they've been consistently floating this 3 credits, Jay King has constantly been playing an order and seeing that Ultra has not been happening. So if John PX floats it again, but on their side, they spend the 3 on this Ultra, it's not quite the same. And so that to me is one of the most interesting spots about this is when does the timing of this Ultra come in and when does that matter for Jay King's side?
And there it is. The Bomber is going to go ahead and lay waste to the fighter that's defending there. There was a use of Monty to pin the board down. Now, he is still sitting on that Royal Research, which has essentially been helping out. There is the Ultra coming in and countering that card, that order that has been played, and Hellcat comes out as the card drawn. In this case, there is a Honey, there is a Bomber as well. A Flying Fortress is sitting pretty over there in the back line, the support line dealing damage. But again, might be a situation of who, it might just go down to who bites first or who can get to their Bletchley Park first. And then the order in which the cards get reshuffled can be a big deal. And there it is, the winner of the 1998 Pontiac Astro Wagon, C. Montgomery Burns makes an appearance and pins the whole board down, draws a card. That's going to buy a little bit of time.
Yeah, Jay King's just, it's it's very difficult on Jay King's side as well. I'd say that one of the things that you're looking at is the Blackwatch that's in hand. When does that get played and how does that get played? If you play it right now, all that's happening is you're turning the 9 cost part of the research on John PX's side into an 11 cost one. Easy. You just play it. If that Blackwatch is played after that 9-point research is played, what that means is the 12 cost Bletchley Park that gets put in hand will be put up to 14 costs at that point. And that to me is a very big measure of Jay King's side and the objective that they have right now is when do they line that up? How do they line that up? And can they keep themselves out of trouble to give themselves the opportunity to line that up as well? A lot of things are happening because it's not just as easy as it looks right now where you just put your big thing in play and hope it works. Jay King's got to worry about threats a little bit more than John PX does.
That is a great, and you'll see it right now as you can see, John PX has gone down the route of, I wonder if he goes and expands the research here. He might be afraid of a Blackwatch that, like you said, will freeze that card out because you just do not have the amount of credits necessary to play it. You'll have to actually rely on a War Bonds, perhaps, to put you up to 14, wherein you could play it. But there, that is the Lancaster B3, which when it comes in, it blitzes. It has the blitz ability, so it's going to go straight to face, dealing some damage. And I mean,
big deal.
It is definitely a big deal. You have 2 Bombers that are hiding behind a guard now that can threaten that HQ.
It's not only that, but the Lancasters, that's slowly ticking up the cost of Jay King's side. And it doesn't seem like much. It's just 1 across, but that disrupts all of the planning that Jay King is going to have on that end. If that Lancaster B3 is not checked and it gets to connect 1 or 2 more times, the damage is significant, but what's more significant is the cost of all of this stuff ticking up over time. And so that's something that Jay King's has to worry about now. They have to pay respect to that and try to figure out a way to put some pressure against that. Because right now, just the Ultra getting ticked up to 4, that's already a big deal. But additionally to that, you're looking at root up the enemies up to 4. The research is up to 7. The Blackwatch is up to 6 now. You cannot let that Lancaster connect again. So it's pin the board down, get some stuff to the front line, and hopefully find a way to stall this Lancaster from attacking. That's the major threat right now.
The board looks pretty ominous if you are J King, because you are staring down the barrel of 2 5-damage bombers that are hiding behind a, albeit vulnerable guard. Right now, all the units on John PX's side are pretty much locked down due to the pinning effect, which, if you are unaware, a pinned unit cannot attack nor can it move. And in this case, they're just there. There's just furniture. As we see the expanded research, perhaps there is the Black Watch still in hand. Actually, using the active sonar instead, that is a good intuitive move based on the fact that you can anticipate a potential Black Watch. Like you said, if you don't have a War Bonds to get you up to 14, Black Watch can really ruin your day if you're looking for that final page of the research book when it comes to Bletchley Park.
It's not only that, but for John PX's side, I think this is great recognition, understanding that J King has made a fairly aggressive maneuver to try to attack the board presence. It gives John PX a little bit of a signal if he's paying close attention. It's going, well, hey, wait a second here. Why is he trying to chip away at the rest of my board? Is it because they can use AoE to shred the rest of this? If that's the case, make them use so much more than they would normally expect to use credit-wise to clear this board away. And so right now for John PX's side, if it is not a carpet bombing plus something else, or a root out the enemy plus something else, they can't use it. And given the fact that everything's in hand has been increased by 4 cost because of the connection with Lancaster, plus the research increasing everything by 3 more, that's a really tough spot for J King. And then suddenly you see why it's such a big issue. Now the bomber remains protected. It's able to keep connecting again. Everything in J King's hand is going to be very expensive. So for John PX, if there's an opportunity to get aggressive, it's probably this spot right now. Start getting some threats on board and start cranking the damage away, because for J King, they've had to answer the Lancaster. And I think that's opened them up a little bit to the board getting a bit out of control.
And look at that denial, the pollution in that hand of J King. All of his cards have been tarnished and just taxed above and beyond what they're typically worth. You're drawing new cards, which will come in at the advertised rate, at the MSRP, if you will. But in this case, a lot of these cards are looking really, really expensive. So all those turns that you would otherwise maybe make 2 or possibly 3 plays, you're looking at likely just 1 play and maybe some movement on the board.
Yeah, even the inefficient poke here from John PX's side, I think they've got a pretty solid read on the hand right now, knowing that J King has got AoE. And I think on John PX's side, that really accounting for the idea that it is root out the enemy, because now this guard unit, it gets wiped out of the field if J King decides to use root out the enemy. And then furthermore, there's not really any reason to use root out the enemy in this spot. So on John PX's side, it's a double factor. Number one, negating some of the board AoE from J King's side, but at the same time setting up shelling for next turn and being able to start marching this giant 5/9 forward to start pressuring the opponents. The Grenadier Guards, it's sort of like an odd card to me, where it's just a lot of stats condensed into one card. It's pretty good defensively if your opponent can't disrupt it, but at the same time, it creates a threat in these more mid-range control style matchups where it's just another big thing. And it's not a very important big thing, just at some point it becomes important. So J King's got to pay attention to that as well. A lot of factors here right now are adding up against J King, and they're even using the research differently here to make sure that they can check the board presence in some way. And so for John PX, as far as I'm concerned, the root out the enemy has been 100% confirmed that it's available in hand. And so now for John PX, it's get rid of the rest of this board, wipe everything out, and continue to remain pressure on these cards that have already gotten tremendous value.
Yeah, the Grenadier Guards, it's not a real sexy card in terms of what it does. It is literally just it's just beef. It's a big butt with a guard, and it needs to be dealt with. That's the problem, is that it has to be circumvented, it has to be removed, it has to be dealt with in one way or another. And there's your call, root out of the enemy has gone on and taken out the Grenadier Guards. And the problem is that the turn's going to go flip back, and that bomber is still going to get some work done. It is going to take out the honey. So, even with the root out the enemy, that Flying Fortress is getting the job done. There's the Black Watch that comes through that is going to go ahead and, again, tax those orders in J King's hand. And things are getting expensive now, and that bomber is literally running the show at this moment.
Yeah, indeed it is. And John PX, again, kind of demonstrating patience and understanding of what's, happening on J King's side. It's very difficult to get something significant in terms of pressure at this point. So for John PX, rather than try to start ending the game, instead they're just leaning on that. They're going, I'm going to continue to make it even more difficult every single turn of the game. They're going one threat at a time They're going one piece at a time, and there's just every time J King plays something, John PX pays attention to that and gets it off the field. That's exactly why the B-17 Flying Fortress is such an important card, is because in a matchup like this one, it's not very good versus an aggressive deck, but it's great when you get into these mid-range matchups that want to crank through attrition. If your opponent can't answer it, it's going to absolutely clean up the board.
Yeah, J King would probably sell his soul right now for a Mustang or something, but he did not opt to choose USA. So that is a pipe dream, if I've ever heard one. And in this case, again, when a bomber is dealing damage to a fighter, they do trade damage, but that one piece, that one little aspect, which is the heavy armor, is going to really protect that Flying Fortress from a lot of potential threats. And the Black Watch is going to get some chip damage in. And like you said, just being very careful about overcommitting to a board when you're playing against a deck that likes to just wipe the board out and really have that AoE, that area of effect all over everything. And the story of the Flying Fortress is now over, Admirable, and now it's time to start dropping even other bigger threats, such as a TBF1 Avenger.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see how John PX handles this on J King's side. It's a matter of doing what you can to try to answer these threats. If Fog of War is coming down, I imagine that this is on the self unit. Yeah, indeed it is. Mosquito, getting cranked out. That's an elite unit, and it's got a very powerful effect on it. And this is a very unusual but interesting use on J King's side that I took note of when I queued into somebody who did this. They Fog of War their own unit, and I was like, that's really weird. But then they just drew the same unit 3 turns in a row, and I was like, that is a problem for me. I do not like that they have 3 of this unit cranking at this point. And so for John PX, it's find a reason to have J King use these abilities, and in the meantime just continue to chip away. I don't think that John feels like that they're under an immense amount of pressure, albeit at some point I think that they are going to start feeling like they are under a bit of pressure. 2 mosquitoes next turn is a pretty massive swing in terms of board presence.
So there's the answer.
Wow.
Is in terms of you having the elite rarity, but there's more of me. You just need to Fog of War yourself, Admirable, and there's no problems there.
I was wowing over to John PX's side. Drawing the carpet bombing with the shelling on the far left means that now there's an answer to 2 mosquitoes coming out on the same turn and wiping off one of the little chip away damage cards that John PX has been threatening J King with. It's been a bit, I'd say, frustrating on J King's side having to answer these super nominal threats that have been taking place. But John PX here says, I want to keep the shelling. I'm going to deal 2 damage with these and then carpet bombing the rest of this. That's really interesting to me.
I think that's a fair idea to use there because, I mean, you're not really going to win the game with that Black Watch. The Black Watch did a lot of what it needed to do, which was just tax those orders in J King's hand. And in this case, if you can go ahead and use the Fury ability, attack twice, go ahead and, save one of the cards like Shelling to go ahead and deal with those 2 mosquitoes. I mean, why not do it? You're ahead on cards. You're ahead on your HQ defense total. As you can see there, the Hellcat's going to come in. The Honey's going to finish it off. And now you have the board as well. So things are going well. John PX being very efficient with his resources.
Yeah, and on J King's side, the resources cost a lot, but they're kind of getting the job done. The problem is that J King's they're running out of answers. And that's, again, kind of the weight of John's deck is that if they have time to make all this happen, their cards are just very pound for pound efficient. And that's a problem. J King, there's an answer. There's another thing. John PX's side, there is plenty to work with.
Beautiful.
Wipe that out with the TBF1.
Yes, the Avenger comes through and just spikes that tank out of existence just like that, hanging on to that. There's the Sexton, though. The Sexton is a nasty little card. It'll come on the deploy effect, pin a unit, and every turn on turn start, repin that unit. But hey,
how about both sides?
Yeah, well, monkey see, monkey do. Let's get going, baby. So at the end of the day, this is actually kind of hilarious. I guess it's he who sextons last, sextons best, I suppose, because now that Sexton's just going to sit in the back line and not be able to function as John PX is going to start advancing with his guard. The Avenger is free to go, but at the beginning of the turn, it will get clocked again by that Sexton.
Okay, Lancaster drawn. That feels like a big one. The problem here is, do you hit headquarters or do you hit threats? And I think you have to hit threats at this spot.
Oh, you've got to go after the. You have to take out that Sexton. It was basically it won the Sexton war basically, and in this case, the Lancaster coming out and dealing with it opens up your own artillery to start dealing with the threats, because that Avenger in the back row is just going to constantly sit there. That is basically, like I said, that is furniture now. That is in a museum. It is sitting back there, pinned for all eternity until that Sexton gets dealt with.
So now for John PX. Warbonds gets drawn, not used. Decides to develop the board just a little bit more. Needs a little bit more to answer some stuff here. And for J King, it is all reactionary countermeasures.
So let's activate them. Why the heck not? That is a scary thing. PX. I mean, how many times, Admirable, have you and I drafted together or played, on streaming together or whatnot, where it's just those countermeasures when your opponent passes with like 7 or 8 credits in the bank, you're just like, okay, what? Like, what is it, man? What are you trying to do to me? So you got to really be careful and step lightly around those kinds of situations where your opponent is not just representing, 5 or 1 or 2, where you can kind of surmise maybe what it is. But when they pass with basically all their credits in the bank, that is a scary thing to sort of stare at.
Wow. And what a weak turn for J King. They've been ground out of resource at this point, and for John PX, it is full speed ahead. How do you take most advantage of this? It is pretty much just open to however you want to make it happen. Now's the time for pressure. It was Sexton and a Flampanzer as a 3-3 versus a 1-4 card in the front row. How on earth is J King going to overcome that?
Yeah, we're just going to go ahead and bounce that card. That should, tie up a little bit of the turn. The Sexton, rather.
One of these new cards, the Doubting System. Ooh, well, I mean, that's probably an answer. The carpet bombing being drawn.
Now, I'm not a doctor, but that looks like the right medicine for this situation to at least keep you a little bit on the board. But no, opting rather to just call it a day.
Yeah.
J King has pulled the chute on that one. And
it's a way to stay alive that turn, but you think about all the things that happen on John PX's side, you know that there's more in the bank that those credits are about to be spent on. Don't sit there and lose and hurt your mentality. I totally understand. I'm not someone who advocates giving up on spots, but I know from experience that when I sit there and I lose, especially in a tournament, it can affect my mentality, and you can tell that these matches have a potential to last a long time. Both these players are clearly favoring the slower decks that are playing a more mid-range variant, and so don't waste your mindset on it. Just go ahead and get that game over with. You're so far behind. Keep your head straight and play for the next couple games.
Now we're going to Germany and Britain. This is John PX coming in with a German main nation deck with Britain as the supporting faction, and we do have a control-oriented deck. Lots of reaction from John PX. It's a little bit more of a reactionary strategy, and one of the best cards that we can all talk about is Leopold is going to be in this list, ladies and gentlemen. So should we ever go down to that spot where 10 credits are just free and clear, we might see the substitute that you don't screw with. It is Leopold. So as we see right now, John PX and J King are trading blows right out of the gate. And I think that, J King is sticking to that British deck.
Yeah, I don't blame him. It's a matchup that I think that when you are used to playing mid-range decks, almost regardless of who you are, you will say that your variant is favored. And that's, to me, one of the beauty of card games in general, is that no matter who you are, your mid-range deck is more favored than your opponent's is. It's just the way that you're going to believe it, and it's the way that you're going to ride it the entire time. I know this, again, from experience and playing in tournaments and absolutely getting trounced in matchups that I had no business trying to win, but just had to anyway, because, that's just kind of how tournament stuff works. I was insistent, and I'll still be to this day, even though I have had people basically prove me wrong. They are wrong. My mid-range deck was favored, and that's just the way it is. Give it another go and show them what it's worth. Now, in this matchup for John PX, you mentioned Leopold, and if we get down to 10 credits, we're going to 10 credits, all right? Neither of these players are coming out with massive threats in the early stage, and so really it's kind of a replay of what we saw last game, which is attrition and then building a line that threatens your opponent. It's not about just, being very aggressive and getting stuff out there and dealing damage. It's about creating a situation where your opponent goes, well, wait a second, if I don't handle this properly, I'm about to take a big hit. And if I take a big hit and then can't answer it, I lose the game. And so that is really what this matchup is about, is how can you get attrition lined up? How can you use your resources very efficiently? And how can you make sure that your answers are going to absolutely punish your opponent at the right time?
Precisely. I think you hit it directly where I was going to go with this, was the fact that sometimes there are certain decks that just, they test your ability to make proper trades, etc. Your aggressive, your sort of killer instinct of going straight to face and dealing damage. This one is going to be more of a, this is an accountant's game where it's going to be who can use their credits most efficiently and preserve as much resources as possible to get the maximum amount of value off of what they're playing. Because if it's just a matter of dumping all the cards and using everything right away, well, you might get punished by board wipes or big swing cards that are going to go ahead and punish that strategy. So in this case, John PX and J King both, especially J King, in terms of using those cards that really punish big boards and big board development, you want to be able to sort of maintain threats on the board for your opponent to deal with, but at the same time, if you overcommit, it can be problematic. So as we saw the previous game where everybody was very patient, good reads, this is a different story now. We're going to see a lot of the same in terms of resource management, but at the same time, you do have to chip away at your opponent's health total. I mean, that's how you win the game, but it's identifying those avenues that make sense and avoiding the big swingbacks, the big clapbacks of punishing by getting either too greedy or just sort of, giving your opponent maybe less of the benefit of the doubt in certain cases.
Yeah, J King saying that credits, certainly where they're concerned, go ahead and wipe out one of John's in this turn. It's very clear that John PX has been setting up a couple turns here with the notion this has gone down. Either the flow to the credits and seeing a countermeasure hit, your opponent drawing a countermeasure in this spot. Can you disrupt them while at the same time buying yourself a little bit of time and a long-term advantage by, again, wiping out a credit? It's a really tough spot for J King because John PX's hand is just so cost efficient at this point, and they've already seen the threat on J King's side that there's research being active on John's side as well. So there is a number of topics that J King has to check at this point.
And there we had a nice
hand is not feeling super welcome for handling the situation properly.
And there he is, the fan sitting in seat 0001. C. Montgomery Burns has gone ahead and pinned everyone to the board, drawing a card as well. Those units are just now there for show. They can't do anything else to sort of help out on the board. So John PX will have a turn of board development, perhaps maybe expanding the research, popping one of the countermeasures as well with doubting system. This could be an opportunity to use your Eagle Claws as well. But I just want to talk real quickly about just the absolute thorn in the side that those C4th Highlanders can bring. When you're not playing aggressively, that 4-cost 1/7 guard that has a lot of defensive potential, man. That thing has been sitting on the back row for J King for a little while there and was really preventing that chip damage that we're talking about, that slow attrition, that slow wear down, as we can see. And now a 5/5 tank with 1 point of heavy armor is the top dog on the field now, which is going to be tough to deal with.
Yeah, I'd say for, kind of contrasting this game with the last one, J King's drawn both Panther Ace. And it's such a massive advantage. It doesn't really feel like much except for the player who's receiving the Panther A spot, where you're looking at your hand and you'll be like, I wonder what draw of mine can change the way my turn reacts. And Panther A it strips that away. It says you don't draw a card next turn, and it's a 5/5 with a heavy armor on it. It really acts everything up as far as I'm concerned. Every single time that card's been played against me and I'm relying a bit on my draw to change the board, I feel like that card strips a ton away. So for J King, both those being drawn this game, I think is giving them a lot more leverage in this one than they've had, I'd say, in the previous game. And so for right now, I'm looking at John PX's side. I'm thinking about how J King has been approaching this. And again, to me, still the big problem is that John PX is cranking research right now. I'd say for J King, they have to find a way to deliver pressure. And that's part of what the Panthers are able to bring in this spot. But for John, he's just been able to clutter the board. He's got, again, plenty of board tense threats.
Mm-hmm.
And board tense answers that are really happening here. It's not easy for J King to answer this stuff efficiently, and I think that's really the big problem that I'm looking at for J King. How are they going to get through this efficiently and avoid the research being absolutely devastating when it gets to that spot?
Now, this is an interesting spot when you use your countermeasures. Obviously, your opponent can sort of see that the credits are floating there as 2 countermeasures are active right now. But the fact is the board state itself was one that didn't really warrant any attacks from John PX. So that mana that was those credits that were floated by John PX in this case was a whole different story. That maybe there wasn't a countermeasure. So, but in which case, at this point, the Mosquito comes through, dealing 3 damage. There is the Panther A. The Highlanders are still standing tall, protecting the back line. Root Out the Enemy is going to get completely shut down by Doubting System, and John PX now is going to respond with 2 countermeasures of his own, Missing and Doubting System, holding back on the Missing at the moment. Missing would destroy a unit that moves to the front line.
I think it's pretty well sniffed out from John PX too. You know, the Root Out getting hit by the Doubting System there. I think that's something that John PX was really accounting for. It's like, well, this Root Out the Enemy is not really doing anything right now, and my opponent's floating credits every single turn. So I guess I'll go ahead and just use this and rip it away. Okay, the Doubting's gone. And so now on J King's side, you've already been checked once in that same. They're thinking about the exact same thing is what it looks like. Like, my opponent is floating credits. I'm thinking about Ultra. I'm thinking about Doubting. What can I get those away with? So Tactical Strike here is the use from J King, because if it's not Doubting System is sitting there, you're going to wipe out your own 5-2 with that Root Out the Enemy. So not the same risk that John PX can take on J King's side. Having to give away a card, I'd say that is a bit better given the scenario here. You're staring at a 4-7 guard on your opponent's end, so no damage getting cranked by your units.
Now floating 8 credits, J King not activating any countermeasures, however, but John PX doesn't know that. He doesn't have that kind of same, connections with the Bothan spies to go ahead and give him that kind of information. In this case, however, John PX is sitting there. He's got some things to think about, such as how to respond to J King and the emote meta, as we saw. Because before I believe there was a Cheerio we saw a. There was an Impossible that was dropped as well. And I mean, emote meta is as important as any meta, but that's not how you win or lose this game in this case. It all comes down to how the numbers trade up. And a favorable spot over here. He is holding the back line. Carpet bombing, however, will take out a lot of those threats. Wow. As again, the Highlanders, I mean, they ate an Eagle Claw, they ate a Carpet Bomb. They're still standing tall. There can only be one, but this case, the Islanders of John PX will go ahead and take the front line. I think this is like, what is this the first time the front line has been taken in a few turns here that has been occupied?
Definitely so. I think that from J King's side, you know, the giant float, I think is supposed to try and represent maybe like an Ultra. Mm-hmm. And on John PX's side, it really does look pretty convincing. But I think at a certain point, you're going to be like, well, it's not the end of the world. Like, I can't ram the research into this. That's super dangerous, which I think is, kind of what J King was trying to accomplish. But John PX having the carpet bombing to be able to check for the Ultra in that spot, that's a big hit to J King's side. Suddenly these little threats that are supposed to develop attrition and then chip away at damage didn't have an opportunity to do so. So J King's back in the same situation that we were last game. How do you check what's happening right now? Because you're falling behind on attrition. The Honeys are great in certain spots. They're not great in these kinds of matchups where they're very oversized by the units on both sides of the board, and the additional defense they crank out on your headquarters. It's not really that big of a deal. You're just kind of giving away cards, and as you reduce your hand size, you increase your opponent's hand read. That's not something you want to do. And so for John PX, they see this doesn't get handled. They see nothing happens. Put a blitz unit down, break the guard, start chipping away. Right.
This is that margin that you're looking for. This is that avenue, that line that was sort of left open by J King. It's not like he's doing this purposely to allow for these tanks to go ahead and knock on his front door. But at the same time, you do have to capitalize on these situations that present themselves for John PX. Now, what's also worth noting here is the fact that John PX is sitting on one more stage of research if he wants to spend those 9 credits to go ahead and have the final frontier of that line of research for the Bletchley Park. However, there's always the threat of having a Blackwatch just come back and bite you in the back. I would say back. I was going to say ass, but I meant back ass, I suppose. I don't know. It made sense in my mind, Admirable. It hits you in the back ass. But if John PX is suspecting a Black Watch, I mean, at a certain point, this is kind of that certain mentality you have where you're holding onto a card because you're afraid it's going to get countered. But if you're holding onto it because you're afraid it's going to get countered, then you're never going to play it. So it might as well have been countered in that case. Eventually, you're going to have to bite the bullet and make that play. I don't know if John PX is just waiting to see a Black Watch hit the board before he completes that line of research, but he's missing opportunities to make that huge play. And I think that if the board does get a little bit more out of control for him to deal with, he will have to take that risk and make it happen.
It's a good point to make, and I think seeing the honeys are hitting play, and kind of thinking about this, it's not necessarily the biggest spot of the research that you want from the German spot. It's really this right here. Making the boat and blowing up an opponent's units and making them discard 3 cards is absolutely devastating. For J King, Convoy gets drawn, though, and that has to be the most welcome sight for J King right now. You just discarded your whole hand. You had nothing to do. Convoy gets drawn. So now you went from going, oh my gosh, I have to discard my whole hand, to suddenly, wait a second, I can still win this game.
That is saving grace, absolutely. Like you said, sight for sore eyes. You discard 3. Well, how about we pick up a card that'll just go ahead and help us out? Root out the enemy is going to go ahead, clear the board. We're even Steven again, and now it's my turn to go to school. Research happening. We're going to expand on that, on the Royal Research, and now I feel like John PX has to sort of start, counting how many turns he has left before it all goes downhill for him.
Yeah, well, I mean, bad news for J King. You drew 2, and John PX is going to draw 4. That seems to be, so far, one of the big deals for this matchup as well, is that whatever J King has, John PX has one bigger. It's just a little bit more greed on John PX's side is absolutely just critical in these matchups. Your cards are just pulling a little bit more, and when your cards are huge, that's a big deal. And so for here, being able to look at the top 3 and fetch one of those cards, Panther A gets drawn. And again, this has turned into a giant attrition game. But on J King's side, they do have Royal Research cranking. And so Bletchley Park, I think, could pull this back to a close to even spot. But right there, Comet gets drawn for John PX. And suddenly the damage is cranking on this side. So I think J King is in a little bit of trouble where things are concerned for here.
That's right. I mean, when you're staring down a Bletchley Park, I believe the best line of play, frankly, sometimes is just to go ahead and hammer away as much as possible and hope that the cards rearrange themselves in a favorable spot where maybe that Comet gets on top of the deck. Perhaps you can go ahead and draw that Panther again to go ahead and have some stability on the board, something that is a little bit more difficult to actually get off and taken away and removed. But in this case, you have to push. You have to go ahead and get that damage registered against J King before he goes ahead and just hits the reset button on your entire game plan here. So the problem, however, for J King is the fact that he's kind of running out of gas in terms of what he needs to do. He doesn't have the mana necessary, but he's getting there. He's definitely getting there. It's a good pin, though. That is a good pin.
Yeah, it's a good pin. The Comet is still a pretty significant threat here. Honestly, Comet's one of those cards that I always feel a bit unusual about, where it costs so many credits to get this moving. But when you're playing these kinds of attrition decks and you have so many reactionary cards, for the control factor, what ends up happening is you just need a way to sync your credits. Like, you have so many credits to use, and you have all these cards that basically in the situation are useless. They all can be useful at some point, but we've gotten down this point where it's only big, real things that matter. And so how does John PX threaten J King if they want to use that last point of the research? And the answer is damage. Comet is the perfect card for the situation, because J King really does not have an answer to it right now.
Yeah, there's nothing that he can really do over here, and not to mention that he's sitting on 20 points of defense in terms of comfort level over here. That is it. That's all she wrote. If I'm not mistaken, destroy. Hold on a second. No, we're not quite there yet. But you're holding on to that Comet, and there's nothing that can really be done.
Excuse me.
Yeah, no.
3/5.
Yeah, the 3/5 is pinned, so we're not quite there, but we might as well, start saying our goodbyes for this game, because it's looking a little out of reach. It's going to take, he's going for the sonar here. Pin all enemies, increase cost of all cards in hand, but that's not going to matter because that Comet operates for free. It is just going to drop in, say hello, and it's back to the hand with it, but we're not even going to get to that point, because that is 2-0 for John PX taking out J King in one heck of a match in terms of Resource management, ladies and gentlemen, it's not always about how hard you swing, but it's all about keeping the books real tight and clean and making sure that those credits count and get as much mileage out of your cards as you can. That was one hell of a matchup here at KARDS BLITZ.
And honestly, it's quite a contrast to the first match we saw as well. You know, when you take a look at aggressive decks like we saw in the first matchup, there's a lot of little micro management things that end up taking place there. And we saw Spoos really demonstrate, I'd say, some very strong notions of how aggressive decks operate. You know, when it's time to unleash all your threats and when it's time to hold some of them back and wait for that right moment. For these mid-range decks that we just saw in this matchup, it's a very different kind of thinking for it, where most of what you see is demonstrated from a macro understanding. Almost all of this matchup is determined from a lot of things that happen outside the game, frankly, like what cards you choose to include and what types of situations you'll find yourself in and how you pressure your opponent through. That's really what we saw in this one, was John PX being able to demonstrate this very strong understanding of how these mid-range matchup works and taking the step to put in a lot more greedy cards that are in this one. You know, instead of running 4 copies of Convoy, they're running 1 copy of Convoy, and a copy of Lend-Lease. You know, stacking all of this into that gives you a little bit more room in your deck to add some more significant threats. We didn't get to see it, but Leopold was included in this deck as well. And then the Comet coming in and delivering a massive amount of damage that frankly just could not be checked on the other side of things. So for J King, I feel for him in that one. Really, it was the deck building that ended up doing them in this spot. There's just too much greed that's included on John PX's side.
Well, a lot of the benefit of having that Comet, and like you mentioned, a lot of the actual, the prowess of the players and the skill level of the players come from the deck building aspect of this game as well. It's not just about how you utilize the cards in the deck, but it's building that deck itself. And like you said, there's a lot of understanding about what you might be coming up with, you need to protect against. And sometimes holding cards, for instance, not expanding research because you're afraid of getting blackwatched and having a card that might be useless later on, not being too greedy, but being greedy enough. And some of these selections, like you said, Comet in this case was accountable for 12 damage. 12 damage that took so long to be able to actually punch through between all the guards, the Highlanders, the defense, the board clears, the this, the that. It was so much fireworks that didn't necessarily land on HQ defense. And when it did finally get through, when you do finally, just expend all of your resources, when you're exhausted of all your potential defenses, and that's when the game starts, and that's when the Comet comes in. And it was too little too late. Getting to Bletchley Park, if you were J King, was you were a turn away from perhaps changing the tides, but it's that little margin where you have to capitalize on. That's John PX gets through to the next round, the finals, ladies and gentlemen. And Admirable, this has been exceptionally fun. Take a look, Admirable, at all these warriors that have come and gone, but there are 2 still standing and 2 waiting to fight for that bronze match.
That's right. You know, this is the only spot in the entire tournament where you could lose and keep competing in the tournament. We have to decide that 3rd and 4th place finishers. So between Ari, Big Ben, and J King, it's been a long fought week through these tournaments that they've been playing, and they found themselves now competing for that 3rd and 4th spot, and I think rightfully so. For Spoos and John PX, though, there is no more losing. It is 1st and 2nd is do or die, and frankly, a big contrast in matchup styles that we see here. Spoos, tending to play the aggressive decks as we saw in that first matchup, and for John PX really striking a big chord on the deck building aspect of it, choosing cards that are very powerful in situations that you're hoping to get into. If they cannot find themselves getting in those situations, that's what Spoos' decks are designed, and where their decision making ends up playing a big factor is they can disrupt that by just creating situations that are awkward, because there are certain cards you expect from control sides of things. So depending on the context they're in, the situation they're in, Spoos' decisions are going to weigh a lot that build into it. And on the other side of things, it's the deck building decisions that are weighing in a lot of those spots. So we're going to see how that contrasts, and we're going to see who comes out on top.
Yeah, and we're going to see how that comes out on top, or who comes out on top, rather, right after this short break. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be featuring the bronze medal match. I say bronze medal, really. It's cold hard cash that they're fighting for, as well as some in-game prizes. But hey, if we had bronze medals and we can send them to you, we would. Unfortunately, however, we have been embargoed on bronze, metal, silver, and all other precious metals. In this case, the pride is what you will be wearing, and the cash in your pocket will be your glorious prize. In this case, we'll be having a short break and come back with that 3rd place matchup. It is KARDS Blitz, ladies and gentlemen, and in this short break, I managed to go ahead and grow a beard because that is what is necessary to be a KARDS broadcaster. The one Christo of the War Room and the pre and post game show, and obviously the legendary, the wonderful, the elite Admirable, also with the beard. This is my beard. I look like some type of sort of floral Amishman at this point, but this is my beard that I've elected to use.
Red beard.
Yeah, I'm red bearding it in this case.
Yeah.
Admirable, the action has been phenomenal, and it's amazing how we had such a long second series there between John and J King. It only went to 2 games, but it did go the distance if you want to get in terms of like a chronological situation as we take a look again at the bracket.
Yeah, we're going to see Ari Big Ben taking on J King in this one. Spoos and John PX, they're awaiting their finals match where they're playing for first and second, but we got to play for third and fourth first. And, pretty heavy contrast of the matchups that we've seen so far, where one of them was very much based on whether or not an aggressive deck could be patient, could be aggressive enough, could unlock the tools that it's using to try and develop an uncounterable threat and finish the game, because you really have that one opportunity, and that's really all you're looking for. Down on that bottom side, though, it's decks that are much more the mid-range side. As you mentioned, it was only 2 games, but it was a very long match. And part of that is just because of the decisions they have made outside of the game, the decks that they have chosen to bring. They've brought these very mid-rangey style decks that are trying to take an aggressive or defensive stance depending on the situation that they're in. But when those decks match up against each other, it's a very different game plan. And oftentimes it's whoever brought just bigger threats is the player who has the natural advantage. There are things that you do during that match that help dictate the pace of that, but really the big difference is what cards they have brought. So between Ari Big Ben and between J King, we're going to be seeing that difference take place. Which of them was able to come up with a strategy that was going to be more solid when they get to the end game, when you've kind of guaranteed that you're going to be finding yourself in that spot, because it's very rare that either of these players are going to be able to get aggressive enough to really drive that match home as quickly as possible.
It's always fascinating to see those matches where you're always geared and you're always sort of driven to go ahead and maximize the amount of credits that you have to spend them all on any given turn. And how many times did we see in that previous matchup where the amount of credits that were floating with or without countermeasures activated? It was quite fascinating, and the discipline to not go ahead and just vomit everything onto the board to go ahead and take an advantage there, only to be caught in by certain traps and otherwise board clears, etc. And in this case, like you said, there is a bronze matchup that we got to get to before we get to the finals. This beard is definitely warm. I will definitely say that. So if we can go ahead, let's get to the action so that I can go ahead and quickly shave this red monstrosity off my face.
Yeah, in terms of the lists that have been brought here, there is one aggressive potential that's on Ari Big Ben's side, and it is a Soviet Japan deck that has been brought. It does feature counter-offensive, of course. That's pretty much the reason to play the Soviet strategy right now, is that you have counter-offensive alongside Winter Warfare to be able to present a massive threat to your opponent, and that is what's going to be kicking things off here for J King's side, playing the Soviet deck. And so for Ari Big Ben's side, it is USA that's been cranked out first, and so that means it is the USA Italy deck that's on that side. And honestly, the USA Italy deck is a deck that I'm a big fan of in this one, because it features a card, Mare Nostrum, which it gives a unit +1/+1, but also it gives the unit the effect that when it deals damage to your opponent, you restore that amount of damage to your headquarters in defense. But right here on the opening, J King has had a massive start with this Soviet deck. Holy smokes, what is going on? This is huge. Look at this start. Flake, you're muted.
I was indeed muted because I was screaming in absolute just excitement at how fast and right out of the gate. Just this is not just a flash in the pan. This is going to start and continue onward with another Greyhound following up. But look at that. And it's going to take everything Ari Big Ben can do here to just kind of mitigate the chip damage that's going to be happening here. But as you can see, that Greyhound, more of those Cossacks are going to be hitting the board, and that front line is well secured. The chipping is chip damage is happening, and the thing here is that Ari Big Ben is just wants to get that war bonds in, and you are getting ahead on credits, you are going to get ahead on card draw, but you're giving up that kind of tempo, that board development that J King can now capitalize on and continue to just look at this, just go ham. And just like that, you're down to 4 defense on your HQ, and you have nothing to show for it on the board.
Yeah, War Production's kind of that card where it really opens up that sort of thing to be happening. And it's not only that, it's the Zukov being able to draw that one particular threat that you get to dump out onto the board quicker than basically anything else that can happen. It's just such a powerful deck in terms of its explosivity. It's not always going to get this kind of draw, but when it does have this kind of draw, it's very, very dangerous. But right there, we're seeing one of my favorite cards that's been introduced to the game, the Ladachima, being able to just be an ambush guard unit for 8 credits, but when it hits play, it destroys a unit in the enemy support line. I love this card, but it is just not getting the job done here. Against a matchup this aggressive, this card is way too costly to be making a huge impact. It's able to, stop some of the stress that's happening in play, but on Ari Big Ben's side, you gotta have board sweeps in order to keep clear at this point, or you have to crank guards into play.
Right. And I mean, there's the problem. It's the fact that even though those cards that you're playing in order to go ahead and remove some of the threats on the board, you want to play those while you're still being able to sort of have some type of threat to go ahead and push back against that amount of aggression that J King was facing. The Greyhounds, the artillery, the Cossacks, everything was just right up in your face right away. You mentioned it. You had that big exclamation of just holy Moses. That was out of control real fast. And when you're playing a ramp deck, the way to beat it is just to fly under the radar, get real hot and heavy, and start pushing face the way that J King did.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the way that ramp decks work, the reason that ramp decks work is because you're not always facing this kind of pressure. When you are facing this kind of pressure, this is really the biggest weakness of ramp decks, is they don't have ways to answer this properly. They have some, but they have to show up, and it's not really something that you get to guarantee you show up, because you've only included usually a couple copies of being able to do so. And then so right here, right away, J King, again, another opening hand that just has an explosive start, and Ari Big Ben, I think, is in real trouble again right away.
Well, I mean, what are you looking to do here? You can expand the research, perhaps. You're going to be eating a lot of damage. If J King can really read the tea leaves here, he'll be just pushing face with everything he can before Ari Big Ben could get the job done. A War Machine, you're still floating a credit there, so that's not all that fantastic. Destroy an artillery unit, sure, no problem. Strafing is going to get the job done to go ahead and reduce some threats, but you're just drawing more cards. Katyusha is such a nasty, nasty little piece there, as Lesser of Two Evils is going to go ahead, and you get to choose what you want here. Another Greyhound. Oh my god, and here comes the supply chain. This can get really ugly real fast.
Yeah, I mean, supply chain is really I'd say the bread and butter of this deck, is being able to turn War Production, discarding all of your non-unit cards, into a benefit, where supply chain is adding additional cheaper copies of itself to your hand. You look at all the ways that there are to discard stuff, there's just really not too many of them, but this deck features them. It's the Lesser of Two Evils, the Draw 2 discard, and the War Production, which is discard, get the extra credits. Both of those things are enabling J King to just basically relentlessly and recklessly crank out threats. That's the problem for Ari Big Ben, is that it happens so recklessly.
Pushing forward with the Yak. Just holding on to that front line and establishing more units into the back line there. Those artillery are really, really ominous when it comes down to Ari Big Ben actually going ahead and play some threats, but he's still, I mean, you could play the Avenger, opting rather for War Bonds, thinking he may have some more time to get the job done, but check it out. J King wasting no time. You already saw him pushing forward with all those attacks right out of the gate. Counterstrike is going to go ahead and mitigate some of that damage, get rid of one of those units, but it's just all systems go here for J King.
Backline gets +2, get the extra credits from the War Production.
And not even forget it. This is just a matter of who's got the better APM. J King has just run over Ari Big Ben for the bronze medal in this game. Just that was what was that? My coffee is still hot. That's insane. That is a stark contrast to the previous chess match that we dealt with. J King apparently has dinner reservations and needs to get the hell out of here ASAP. Admirable, walk us through that maelstrom.
That's extra credits. That's what they do. And historically in card games, generating extra resources in order to play your cards has been the undoubtedly most powerful thing that you can do. There are various ways of doing it, but War Production reads it pretty straightforward. Discard these cards that are not units, get extra credits, and use the rest of your cards. With this deck in particular, again, it can take advantage of the fact that it's discarding cards. And while we saw that happen, to me, the important part of this was just, A, that there was a super efficient threat in play. It was dealing a damage to J-King, but he's getting to draw an additional card every single turn. And then right afterwards, it's getting artillery units in play and then buffing up your backline. When your backline is able to attack, what that means is your backline is constantly a threat to your opponent. So whether you're using Yura or whether you're using the Patriotic Firestorm to buff your backline, it doesn't matter. They're both going to crank out a bunch of extra damage. And in that one, you combine that with the M8 Greyhounds, is just way too much for Ari Big Ben to handle when he's playing a ramp deck.
Well, just looking at the sheer amount of artillery that J-King was bringing to the party here. I mean, 3 anti-aircraft guns, the 3 Katyushas. You had the 4 anti-tank guns as well, and 4 Greyhounds to make them even more deadly. And like you said, you're playing some cards such as Patriotic Firestorm to just give those cards extra reach, to giving them a lot more mileage off of what they're otherwise capable of doing. And they don't trade damage, they just dish it out. So now that is our bronze medal game that J-King just went ahead and Firestormed through. And if I'm not mistaken, the also bearded and ever so handsome The One Christo is standing by to have an interview with the winner of the bronze medal game. That is J-King. So let's kick it over to our good friend, The One Christo.
We just saw you come off of a crazy series to secure 3rd place. You 2-0'd Ari in less than 10 minutes. Now, we've seen Ari numerous times, and we know he's a very strong competitor. What happened exactly?
So I'd played against Ari during the qualifiers, and I had a vague idea of what he had been playing up until top 4. And I had not seen any deck that could beat artillery. I'd seen him play aggro, which can take games off of artillery, but it's about 50-50. I'd seen him play a discard deck, which is very bad into artillery, and I'd seen him play ramp, which is very bad into artillery. So I figured I'd start with artillery, get the first win, and he brought ramp. And ramp into artillery, as we saw, is just a brutal matchup for the ramp deck. And I lost to Ari in one of the first qualifiers because I brought Artie in game 1 and then switched decks, and he knew I was going to switch decks, so he counter-queued me. So I considered switching off, but I ended up deciding that I'll just bring artillery a second time, try to do some mind games with Ari, and it worked out incredibly well. So
kind of learning, I guess, from that mistake at the beginning of the qualifiers, did you end up just kind of going with your tried and true decks, or did you tweak them much as you went on throughout the tournament?
I didn't change my decks much, but I changed which decks I was using quite a bit depending on the matchup. I was going with a ramp deck, the aggressive artillery deck, and then a anti-aggro discard deck, depending on what I thought my opponent was bringing.
Got it. So like you said, a little bit of the mind games, trying to read your opponent, trying to figure out what they're going to bring and what you're best set to queue into.
Yeah.
So, obviously you're taking home a couple bucks with your win of the 3rd place match. And you'd probably rather be talking about how you won the whole thing than how you won the 3rd place match. But, going back and looking at it now, we talked a little bit about your strategy. What would you have changed, if you had to do it all over again?
I think by far my biggest mistake was with the decks I chose going into my semifinals match versus John PX.
Mm-hmm.
I knew he had been playing artillery throughout the entire tournament, and I knew he had been playing artillery during his qualifiers because he had streamed a few of his games.
Mm-hmm.
So I was expecting the artillery, so I switched off of the ramp and artillery decks I'd been playing up until that point to an anti-aggressive deck, just because I thought I had the read. I thought I had the counter queue, and he brought ramp, absolutely demolished me. And I'd seen him switch decks every single time, so I thought, well, if he won with ramp, he's going to switch to artillery, so I'll stick with my anti-aggressive. And he switched to his own discard deck and absolutely demolished me. So I think from that, I think I should have just stuck with more proactive decks and decks that I know I can pilot well, and even if it's not a perfect matchup, I think I should have just stuck with what I'd been winning with.
That's really interesting that you say that, actually, because we discussed during the pre-show a little bit around strategy with Bubbles and Darkness, and Bubbles brought the same thing up. You know, he thought that maybe just sticking with what he was comfortable with, what he knew worked, and just going through the whole tournament that way would have been the best way to do it, because he had the same experience where he started second guessing himself or started trying to think things through, changing things around, and it didn't quite work out for him. So speaking of the format in general, obviously Blitz is new to cards with the qualifiers during the week in the top 32. How did you like this setup?
I really loved it. I'm very hopeful that this continues in some way going forward. I think having the smaller qualifying tournaments during the week is a really good way to bring in a lot of players and for people to find what time works best for them with the different time zones. And then top 32 was really fun to play in with the very just fluid nature of what decks you can bring. You're not locked into specific decks. You're not locked into specific nations. So personally, I prefer the more like open deck lists where you can like study every single card your opponent's running. But I know that those take a lot more effort to put on, and there's a lot more work behind the scenes. So I'm really grateful that you guys were able to put on this tournament, and I hope that we can continue having tournaments that appeal to everybody.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that feedback so much, Jaking, and congrats again on your third place victory. Hopefully, I will see you again soon in the next Cards Open.
Thank you.
Well, there's the journey, ladies and gentlemen, that all of these warriors had to go ahead and trek through in order to get to where we are right now, which is Cards Blitz. Admirable, we're here, and we are at the final two, the finals, the grand finale, as it were. J King, as you can see, they're speaking with the wonderful Christo about his victory, but now that is old news. That happened like 6 seconds ago. It is in the past. It's time to look forward, Admirable. I got no time for games, but these games that are laid out in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, it's 7 internet seconds. You know, that's like 7 years in real life. With Spoos and now with John PX here, again, it's a very contrast of matchups from what we saw them actually play and how they end up going through it. But now we're going to see if Spoos can repeat that again with the aggression that he had, where he wasn't able to win in his first game, but it did pull back 2 in a row afterwards against John PX, who has just really demonstrated how important it is to be making decisions outside of the game just as much as it is inside of the game as well. Deck building is a really big part of this, but a lot of the choices that are made for John PX here, they're not necessarily going to be strong versus what we saw from Spoos in the first match. So I'm curious to see if he can fend off the aggression from Spoos' side and if they can capitalize on it, or if Spoos is going to run away with the games.
Well, I mean, we've seen it happen before where there's some back and forth. Spoos did lose the first game, like you mentioned, and did come back and take the next 2 in order to advance. And then now here they are in the finals. We have seen literally a tale of 2 different types of games. It has been, hot and heavy, fast and furious, and it has been slow, calculated, meticulous, and just real accurate in terms of how they execute their game plan. So what will the final bring? Will it be a little bit of both? Who knows? But we are ready to rock and roll, ladies and gentlemen, here for Cards Blitz. It is the final. $1,000 USD is on the line for our 4 contestants, our 4 players. The bottom half has been already taken care of and sorted out, but this is it. This is the cream of the cream, la creme de la creme, the top shelf whiskey, if you were. John PX of Belarus versus Spoos of Germany.
Yeah, and John PX going to be leading with Germany, Britain. That's on the line. I'm going to get that deck list pulled up. And on Spoos' side, you're seeing that it's led with Japan and Soviet on that side. So the Japan-Soviet deck was the one that was unable to grab a win in the first game that it was played here. For Spoos, clearly demonstrating that the deck, not only is it strong, but they have confidence in it as well. The thing that I like most about this deck is that Japan naturally has a lot of aggressive cards in it. The cards are very cheap, they're efficient for their cost, and a lot of times they don't really have operation cost on them as well. Taking a look at 34th here, for instance, as the first example. This card not costing operation is really what makes this card so powerful. You take a look at so many other cheap units in the game, they all require operation costs. This one, if you don't answer it, it just keeps chipping away over and over and over again. That's a big problem when you're having to play defense. So on this side, from the deep, able to answer here, but look at the cost that's in play to operate on Spooz's side. This is just free damage they're going to get the rest of the game.
And that's what the benefit is. And then a lot of people might be turned off by the fact that 34th Infantry is going to go ahead and, shave cards off the top of your deck. But it doesn't matter because everything is cheap, is expendable. The whole point of this deck is to just get as much on the board, push face, go forward. The low operating costs are going to help you here. Flampanzer can go ahead and answer a little bit about that. John PX just playing that when necessary. And the 34th did not complete that home run hit that they're looking for to get the 35th off the top, but the 35th does come out of the hand either way. Spooz does have a more formidable board, but John PX is looking to go ahead and maybe make short work of what's going on here in terms of just outvaluing unit for unit. Now, the problem is that Spooz is now that he's lost the front line, getting it back is what's on his mind.
Yeah, and so this is where, stuff like 41st Bicycle Regiment really kicks into my head, is that this isn't the ideal use of a card, but honestly, given the situation, it's a pretty ideal use of the card. You're able to wipe out something that's contesting front line and then move a 5/5 unit to that front line instead. That is a massive difference that you get to make from just a 1-cost card. You look at Blitz Fury on a 0 operation cost, it seems like such a powerful unit, but it's so very vulnerable to everything that's out there. This is another use that you get from a card like this. And so for Spooz, having a card like that in your deck is such a big importance because Flampanzer is it's such a heavy hit against so much of what your deck is trying to do. And so for John PX's side, it's drive that 5/5 back, make sure you're not taking the damage from that. And for Spooz, they've gotten some extra resources. Can they start overwhelming the board position now? Because John PX is starting to get to the higher credit line, and that means Spooz can be in trouble to some of the bigger cards that John PX has loaded in the list.
And, as you're mentioning it about just dumping cards onto the board and producing threats, if possible, wherever they, as many as you can put on the board. Yeah, you have a 3/5 fighter in your back line that is basically going to be trading up with perhaps removing some of the smaller threats on the board. But eventually, I don't think Spooz is really even interested in making trades unless it's absolutely necessary. I think what he's looking to do in this case is to just continue to push face. Unfortunately, root out the enemy is going to make short work of that board, and it's going to be, all right, back to the building phases, back to square one. We've got to go start dropping some units on the board. No countermeasures operational. There's no mana floating. It's time to just go ahead and get what we can do. As you can see here, a really nifty Bloody Sickle on your own unit to maximize the card draw potential that you can here. Because when it comes to aggro, Admirable, one of the weaknesses typically is the fact that you just run out of gas. You just run out of cards, you run out of threats that you can actually produce on the board for your opponent to deal with. However, having some of those really creative, those nifty plays like that one will keep your hand pretty healthy.
Yeah, it's a really unfortunate spot for Spooz here, too. They choose to develop this 2/2 and push it forward. The real use of this card is being able to wipe out Blackwatch, and that's clearly not something that's on John PX's side, but a second root out the enemy has been in John PX's hand. And so for Spooz, that is a devastating hit. And this is often at times what it can feel like to play an aggressive deck, is that your opponent has the right answers, and you're like, well, now how am I supposed to even win the game? Really, the answer is you're probably not. But your opponent only has 2 root out the enemies in their entire deck list. They're not always going to have it. It's not always going to be there. And when they don't, a lot of times they can be in trouble for this. There's plenty of other things that are sewn into the deck list to be able to check these early threats. But from Spooz's side, this is one of the most devastating feelings that you can experience, is your opponent had both wiped the board cards to both of your developments. Mm-hmm. And you took a risk when you decided to develop Blitz Threat. You looked at your spot and you said, I just got to find a way to threaten something and crank damage. Right now, it's not enough. And then you get wiped again. It's just a tough spot to be in.
The problem now for Spooz is the fact that his sort of spot check removal elements are not as abundant, obviously, as John PX's are. He's got a few options in order to just maybe remove a pesky guard that might prevent him from finding lethal. But using that Sendai Regiment to get rid of a card, you only have 2 of those in your deck. You've got the single bombing raid, which he has in his hand. Your options of actually going ahead and using orders or specialized cards to deal damage when necessary, that's limited. You don't necessarily have what you need to get it done. But again, some nifty use of all your resources to get rid of one tank. You are now donezo. It's all gone. Your hand has been completely spent. You've got 3 points of damage represented on the board, and yeah, you're ahead on HQ defense, but that's going to go down the drain in short order.
Yeah, I mean, Admiral Hipper just makes quick use of this here. Send the unit back to hand, get the tank back. It goes away again to the regiment, but you don't get to draw a card. And so now what's happened is you spent all your resources, your opponent drove it back to the exact same situation, except there is a 10 credit line coming into this turn. John PX has 7 cards in hand, and for Spoos, there are no cards in hand. It's just been one of those games where your opponent had both board wipes. You have little to no chance to come back from that situation. So for Spoos, keep playing it out, keep trying to deliver, but it's slim to none, to say the least.
Yeah, when it comes down to rooting out the enemy, having 2 of them against a Japanese aggro list like this is just, it's heaven sent. You'd love to see it. It feels good, especially when pretty much the majority of your cards are going to survive it real nice. Tactical Strike is going to get a little 2-for-1 hit there. You're going to remove a threat and get one of your threats back. That is, oh man. And top decking the Winter Warfare, we're going to play it for fun. Good game, my friend, from John PX. That was fast and furious. If ever I've seen it, you basically have to, you have to weather that initial storm, but from those really aggressive lists, and you get lucky sometimes. You find both answers, and you wipe the board once, and you wipe the board twice, and eventually it's just once the credits get into the 7, 8, 9, 10 range, that's when John PX can come back and not only develop the board but also move his pieces around and start trading. So that worked really well for John PX, and Spoos has another shot at this one, opting rather in this case to use his German and US deck.
Yeah, and for on John PX's side, swapping over as well to the Britain-Germany deck that's in place here. And I have to say that for the counteroffensive Japan deck, it has demonstrated its weakness, which is getting its threats chewed apart. If that happens, it has very few ways to actually recover. It's snowballing the situation you're in with the counteroffensive and with the Rising Sun card draw that's really making the difference here. For Spoos' side, though, this is a much different list. It's trying to take advantage of tanks and really utilize the new Panzer that's come into effect with the Panzer IIIF, and that buffs up your tanks across the board. It has Blitz itself, and it's granting your other tanks Blitz as well. That combined with Fast Hinds means that while your stuff can get chewed apart here, you didn't have to invest too much if your stuff gets chewed apart to where you're pretty much just out of resources at that point. What's happening instead is that every single line that you develop is a major threat because there's ways to buff these units and take advantage of them. And I'd say the biggest one that we saw in match number 1 was the 5th Panzer Grenadier, giving a unit Fury with the pincer effect. You get a big enough tank in the front line, and suddenly pincer doubles up the damage, and the game ends. And I think for Spoos, this is really the deck to use to try to tackle the rest of the situation, because John PX's decks have shown that they have light AoE, and you can't just be super weak to AoE because all of the decks they've played so far have had the maximum copies allowable in it. So for Spoos here, can you take advantage of the fact that now you have a slightly more resilient line of threats to be developing and then capitalizing with in a slightly weaker way, but still a pretty effective one?
Spoos has been very adamant about holding on to that front line. If you've noticed, opting rather than develop a bigger unit, but just drop a smaller unit and move forward and attack face there as, just pushing damage wherever it exists. And in this case, same thing. I mean, he's going to drop a unit rather than dropping the M4, but rather opting to use those points, that tank in the front line, to go ahead and continue to push damage. There's a very aggressive mindset from Spoos here, especially against this, these British decks that can regain health when necessary. And by just keeping that health total as low as possible, continuing the pressure, developing threats, albeit nothing enormous. It's just death by 1,000 little cuts at this point, and eventually something has to give for John PX. He has to go ahead and actually develop some sort of unit presence on the board to sort of fight back, to push Spoos back. Although looking at the hand as it exists right now, what's the plan here?
Well, right now it's Sexton pinning a unit twice is a big deal, and the carrier cover being able to send a unit or ramp ends up coming into effect in this spot as well, bouncing the Panzer IIA back. Panzer IIA had multiple buffs on it at that point, and it goes from a 1-3 to suddenly, it's a lot more than a 1-3. And in this spot, Spoos is going to say, if you want to spend 5 more credits to get that Sexton pinned out again, go ahead. I have a line of threats right now, and you showed me you didn't have carpet bombing last turn, so in my head, you might just not have it at all. Taking that risk here, we can see in John PX's hand, there is no board sweep that's available in hand. So right now, this line of threats that's just kind of medium stuff, it looks more kind of like stuff you encounter in draft. It's just stuff that's pretty efficient. Right now, it's ultimately threatening to John PX because the backup to this is not like a draft. The backup to this is the same lines of efficient threats cranking out turn after turn every single time. They have to be able to check this. And frankly, right now, this is not getting the job done. This is a honey. This is another double pin. And then the rest of this damage suddenly gets to pour on. John PX, half of their health total is gone just from these two units that are remaining in play. This is really, really tough for John PX right now.
It's worth noting as well that that's half of the health total gone before he even established anything on the board that can stick. Everything's been bounced, removed. He's been pushing face. He's been relying a lot on or investing a lot in ramping up as much as possible in order to go ahead and play some of those bigger threats. But I want to talk about the importance, the sheer value of having Blitz on those tanks in order to deploy them and take the front line, because that 99th would have been useless against that Sexton if he wasn't able to go ahead and push forward. He could have played the 109th and moved forward with that, breaking the smoke screen ability and leaving it vulnerable in order to bounce the card. But being able to just go ahead, drop a cheap tank, move it forward, get the job done, bounce the card, and you're just doing, you're doing God's work in this case. Like, and removing the Sexton, although that you had to go 2 for 1 over there, you have the advantage on the front line. You do still have the tank in the back row that now is no longer pinned down. You can continue to push threats. I think that you have to get rid of that honey. It could be problematic if he starts drawing cards, and that is a big card to deal with. Oh boy.
Yeah, I mean, things do get dangerous. I'd say from Spooz's side, the lack of any way to disrupt this board presence is kind of a big deal. I mean, there is a way to disrupt it, with the M16. That actually is a pretty massive unit to be having in a spot like this. But for John, it's crank this, gain some defense in the headquarters, and then also jump the credits up again. For John PX's side, it's a matter of now, can these units that are just big enough end up taking over these board sides? And so for Spooz here, you see it's not just as easy as, push this 5-9 out of the way and try to deal some damage in this spot. Instead, it's going to be Africa Corps looking for ways to develop the board and contest this and use the M16 to punish rather than disrupt. I think this is a really important use of this card. I think a lot of times it's really easy to push this 5-9 back to hand, chip away some more damage. The 5-9 comes back down, and then you're out of stuff. Instead, use the Africa Corps there. Get a threat that's outside of your deck, perhaps, because it's just pulling a unit from thin air. Get something from outside the deck and use that to threaten John PX in this spot. John PX, they've used a lot of resources, and frankly, they're running a little bit thin on stuff. Can you use that in order to threaten the opponent? I think that's really the big question here.
I'd say that just the sheer size of that unit is more like he pulled it out of fat air. That is a massive, massive option for him to take there, though it does have a 5 operating cost, which is it's an expensive thing to rely on. But
it's a weird unit.
He does have bolster the ranks in that list, so that could be a way that he could draw off the top to really make that threat enormous. He can't play it yet. Obviously, he's in best case scenario 2 turns away from a bolstered Panzer, that massive unit that he could really get maybe turn the tides with here and start fighting alongside some of those bigger threats that are in the back row, in the support row for John PX. But it has come back and forth. That initial aggression from Spooz has finally been met with some resistance from John PX, resulting in a little bit more of an equal-sized board here. There's threats on both sides: bombers, infantry, tanks galore, and all the while, John PX is still 3 credits ahead of Spooz in this case.
Yeah, to me, the big difference here is the TBF Avenger being able to not only crank a threat down, but also at the same time threaten to start wiping away stuff that Spooz wants to develop on the back line. Not only that, but there is a chance that John PX can, take multiple different angles here. Number one, do you want to crank damage to your opponent's face, or do you want to take that time to refuel yourself, replenish, and just keep developing defense at that point? I'd say from John PX's side, there's not really a threat of pressure from Spooz's that's, where you're taking like big risks by redeveloping or just, continuing to draw cards. And I think that's a big opening for John PX. Crank that Lend-Lease, and now is going to just be cranking defense for the rest of the time. And for Spooz, that defense eventually transitions into offense. That's how the whole mid-range deck thing works. So for Spooz, I think that taking this 9 was probably one of the stranger options to take, but I think it's one of the options that could perhaps solidify at some point in this game. That is a hefty unit, and if it gets to the front line, it's cranking 2 cards a turn, and it's not an easy card to answer. So for Spooz here, it's how do you use these tools to get back into the game and then rely on this big 9 that you found from the Africa Corps in order to carry that game home for you afterwards. It's a very tall task that Spoos has ordered here, but if they can get it done, I think it'll show you why cards like Africore can be so powerful.
But oh, how the turntables, as they say, as we can see, the 10 points of defense that John PX was leaning on has now become more than double to 21 off of some nifty card draw with the honey, as well as some early research benefits. And as you can see here, the M4A1 is now just presiding on the front line. Now, unfortunately, that bomber is going to be problematic, as you can see right there. It's just depositing some damage. Yep. Clear. And some interesting animation choices as the the honey decided to jump the gun and go ahead before it died, but that was all right.
It's because John PX is cranking this so fast. I mean, being able to use the bomber, then drop the Kitty Hawk, and then move the honey forward, which has survived for multiple turns now, and then also chip away for 2 damage. Spoos is in a devastatingly tough spot. John PX has gotten so many credits. They've been cranking full value the entire time, and they're even at 14 on their credit line. So from here, Spoos needed something to stick. It doesn't. It gets retreated back to hand. And for Spoos, it's just been run over at this point. John PX was able to ramp, check the threats that were there, and Spoos was not able to climb out of the situation. For Spoos here, it's not happening.
Speaking of check, it's more like check please in this case. If you're Spoos, the most devastating thing is you have that massive threat, that 9 credit threat, the big boy, the fat boy that you want to just slam down with authority and say, look what I found, Grandma. Unfortunately, when you can just retreat it back into your hand, it's a turn wasted, and you just laugh at it. That is a scary board. It's literally we call this one the Royal Sampler, because you've got a little bit of everything. You've got a bomber, you got a fighter, you got a tank, you got some infantry, you got a little something for Grandma there. You got the kids are happy. Everybody's
truly the full English breakfast.
Incredibly so, yes. The only thing you're missing is some good tea. But what are you really popping back that makes sense in this case? I mean, now it's just damage control and prolonging, but I think it's kind of the writing's on the wall if you're Spoos.
Yeah, I mean, just backline damage not able to be answered. Spoos knows it. Tosses out the good game, my friend. John PX, keep chipping away. Got all the threats, all the cards, and 14 credits a turn to work with.
Oh, boy.
Not lethal this turn. But it's as close as you get.
Yeah, that is just devastating. I mean, at this point, it's all a formality. Let's go ahead and War Machine it up to 15 because, hey, budget calls for it. We've got more credits to play with in this case. So we've got there's a TBF1 Avenger just waiting for the worst thing that's gonna hit the board. And cool deck, sorry old chap. That is how the pros do it, ladies and gentlemen. Cheerio, adios. He's on his way for not just a full English breakfast, but perhaps he'll be eating well for all 3 meals of the day, as John PX of Belarus comes in 2-0 sweep of Spoos. Spoos, that is somebody who is no slouch when it comes to cards. Big victory for John PX.
Yeah, and quite frankly demonstrated the power of specific cards in specific matchups. In game number 1, the 2 copies of Root Out the Enemy swept the board away, and Spoos couldn't come back. And then in game number 2, it was, I'm not under heavy, significant pressure right away. Use that to ramp my credits up and then start playing a bunch of big stuff. And that bunch of big stuff is just enough to basically, play the role of any card given the matchup type here. Spoos is trying to, play a slightly heavier aggressive deck, but if you can't threaten your opponent right away to have to use all of their answers in a row just to, stabilize themselves, it means they get to ramp. And if they ramp, they get out of control. Just what it boils down to.
You're absolutely right. And in this case, John PX has taken the win in the KARDS BLITZ tournament, hosted by 93 Media and, of course, our good friends at 1939. Wonderful tournament. The gameplay was fantastic. I know that you and we spent several hours just thumbing through these deck lists and just being there's a little bit of what we were familiar with and a lot of little surprises, little minutia picks that we were really into. And, sometimes it's just unfortunate we never got to see the full Bletchley Park or the Manhattan Project pop off. Leopold didn't necessarily come down like an iron fist, but no, it was all just excellent gameplay. It was fast. It was real, furious. I hate to say that over and over again, but there was punches being thrown back and forth.
Well, I mean, they said in the movie title like 7 times. I think you're free to actually speak it a few times.
Yes, Vin Diesel will eventually show up on the show to sort of plug a movie because I've plugged it for him so many times.
Cards is just it seriously is. It's been like one of the most intriguing card games that I have played in quite a long time. It's adding operation cost to units was something that hadn't really occurred to me, and I hadn't really personally experienced in playing card games before. So the fact that it's adding this other dynamic into how you're having to spend your resources means that they get to open up a lot of other portions. Like, for instance, being able to ramp so far beyond, like, I would say what's like traditionally 10 and like, recent digital card games. The fact that you're going beyond that point is a big deal. The fact that the cards are so powerful, but individually they aren't necessarily as powerful as you see in some other games. It's the fact that you combine everything together and it works like a machine. That's a big part of cards to me, is that there's just so many unique things that you can do that are very powerful that you can almost turn anything into a threat. It's like you have these combos and then what carries the combos. And we saw a lot of that here today. In this case, the winner, it was the ramp cards are what carries the rest of your combos. It's get a lot of extra credits and start playing a lot more cards. And frankly, when you're playing a lot of cards and you're spending a lot of credits and you're drawing a lot, those are like my favorite things to do in games. Draw lots of cards and put them all into play. What more can you ask for?
I mean, when you're playing with a lot more of the house money than your opponent may be playing with, it's a whole different story. Draw cards, play big freaking monsters on the board, and say, "Here, you deal with it," kind of thing. And like you mentioned, Cards is a very unique game. It operates, it kind of is designed within a very familiar framework, but the way that they execute it is phenomenal. But enough from us, because the winner of this tournament was John PX and of Belarus, and we do have the one Christo who's standing by to interview the winner of Cards Blitz.
Inaugural Cards Blitz champion John PX. Congratulations, John. We also have Ykrad here to help us do the interpreting. So let's start off just by keeping things simple. John, how do you feel after that huge victory?
Итак, Джон, как же ты себя чувствуешь после столь славной победы?
Да, во-первых, привет всем и спасибо.
Well, yes, hello everyone. First of all, thanks a lot for congratulating me. This goes without saying, it was awesome, and I feel great after such an achievement.
Это второй, я продолжу, это второй.
This is only my second tournament, and I still can't believe how it is even possible, especially considering how much random is involved during mulligans and throughout the match. And while Singleton was more for instilling self-confidence in myself and creating an image, since it wasn't too lucrative from the reward standpoint. BLITZ tournament instead had all the top players participating in it. So this victory is much more meaningful to me.
Absolutely. And you didn't have an easy path getting here as well, defeating some big names. So you mentioned this is only your second tournament, and it's a pretty unique format. How did you prepare for this tournament?
Мне понравился, ну, честно признаться.
Well, I enjoyed it, but to tell the truth, there wasn't a lot of time to prepare for it. So I had to rely on decks that already worked before. I had to rely a lot on my luck as well. I think in this game, luck is decisive.
So you ran through the entire top 32 while losing only one match. So you may say you didn't have a lot of time to prepare, but at the end of the day, you did very, very well. You relied on decks that worked for you in the past. Did you play the same decks? Did you change your strategy a lot throughout the tournament? Or was it always kind of the same direction that you took?
Да, я проиграл в той.
Well, yes, that one loss was against Innocent Bubbles. He got away with just one health remaining. You could say this was almost the only time I got unlucky in this tournament, but it still hurts a little. I played at least 4 decks with different nations. Switching between them is what helped me achieve such results. Sometimes it was a sheer lottery due to the format, but still I enjoyed it, especially considering how it ended.
В финальных матчах я использовал только 2 колоды, так как финал всегда глубже.
In the final matches, I've only used 2 decks, as the final games are always harder and players avoid taking risks. I got lucky because, for example, J King was running a custom British bomberless deck that would have been extremely good against faster decks, and that helped me a lot. But even then, the game was very tense.
Со Спузом мы уже встречаемся 3-й раз.
I've been matched against Spools 3 times during these last 2 tournaments. But I managed to guess, or maybe someone helped me to guess, what to expect from his decks, and I was able to counter his fast, aggressive game plan.
Very nice. So you mentioned as well that you played Singleton in the past, and now you've jumped into KARDS Blitz. Obviously, these are some pretty unique formats. How did you like the format of KARDS Blitz with the qualifier and then the top 32?
Да, мне очень понравился этот формат, без бана, без...
I really enjoyed the format in which you don't ban decks and have no idea what your opponent is bringing. This also added an element of mind games. For example, if after game 1, I or my opponent played something aggressive, like artillery or counter-offensive, the other had to adapt to this and switch to a deck that counters those strategies.
Да, и в этот момент у игроков есть отличная возможность.
At this point, both players have an opportunity to surprise each other by selecting something completely different. This was a very interesting moment during this tournament, as choosing the right deck could decide the upcoming match. This was one of the things that helped me getting to top 32 and top 4.
Amazing. Well, great job. And thank you again, John, for taking the time to join us here. Congratulations on your victory. And I look forward to seeing you defend your championship in the next KARDS event.
Thank you.
Noting as well, my good friend Admirable, but our good friend John PX here, this is a back-to-back win for the Belarusian. This is somebody who won the Singleton tournament and now comes back and defeats Spoobs in the finals for the Blitz tournament.
Yeah, I think it's also, to me, one of the most interesting things I heard from the interview was talking about this particular format where the rules were really kind of thrown out the window. As long as you could build your deck and play it, that was the only rule you really had to follow. So after game 1, depending on what you saw from your opponent, dictated a lot of what happened in game number 2, and then the guessing game begins on that spot. It's very clear they've demonstrated, given their explanations and given the situation that happened where they won the tournament, that they've been guessing pretty darn well. So there's always a lot of guesswork to be done in KARDS. They mentioned that the luck was a factor in it, but you only need that hint of luck at the right moment. You don't need to be lucky the entire time, just at the right moment, and then the guessing games and the deck building does all the rest.
Yeah, you just needed once to just top deck a root out and you're fine, right? Like against the Japanese aggro list, but it happens. That's the way she goes. That's how the cards are drawn. Admirable. I do want to let you know that if you are interested, you specifically or anybody who's watching, for more KARDS tournaments, there is the KARDS Open 5. The Swiss portion of KARDS Open 5 will be taking place on April 3rd and April 4th. I would probably recommend that if you want to get in on this and maybe fight for some of that sweet chicken, that's chicken scratch. I was going to say chicken scratch. It could be chicken or it could be scratch, but it can't be chicken scratch together. But if you want to fight for it yourself, you can go ahead and follow 93 TV on Twitter. Join the Discord. Also check out KARDS CCG on Twitter. They'll be letting you know all about that. Admirable, this has been phenomenal. I think that this is a great tournament. The game is amazing. The community is awesome as well. I had a phenomenal time.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for having me. When I started playing KARDS, one of the first things I noticed about it was that you couldn't be aggressive in the same way that you can be in other card games. And then when I started noticing that, it meant that everything else had a cascading change, really because of a few tweaks in some mechanisms. And so for me, there's two factors that I've always considered that are super important, which is number one, is the game fun to learn? Indeed it was. And then number two, is it designed well and does the aesthetic match everything else that's happening? And it very clearly does. I have to say, this is the first game that's ever made me go and Google history topics to learn about things. And I am quite proud of that, because if there's one thing I've pretty much never done, it's Google history topics to learn about things. So thank you to 1939 for such a fantastic game here, and thank you for having me as well. I've had a lot of fun, and I'm really looking forward to more card stuff that I can do in the future, as well as what I can see from others when it comes to this game.
I think that the first game that I ever Googled from a historical element was Clue, because I thought Colonel Mustard was actually based on a true character. Unfortunately, I was incorrect. Same for Professor Peacock, or whatever their name are, Miss Scarlet, etc. Nonetheless, friends, thank you so much for watching us here at 93 Studios, taking care of this. Big thanks to Mark Theus, to the mods as well. Again, Mark Theus, who's put together this entire production. Phenomenal, amazing job. Admirable, it is my honor and pleasure to be able to cast with you. Obviously, we play a lot of card games together privately, but this is our first foray into the craft together, and obviously to the developers of KARDS. Thank you so much. And to the contestants, obviously, all the players who spent so much time and effort to get to where they are, and big congratulations to John PX for winning it. Admirable, I'll let you cast us off from this one. But again, thank you. Love you all, and have a good night. Admirable, ship us away.
Thanks everyone for watching. Get out there and play some cards. See you next time.